Notorious. Shifters Forever Worlds. By L. Thorne. Chapter 1. Mae's coming. Circe Brazos scowled at her brother and sisters. Marco, her brother, the only brother she had, not to mention her best friend at least these days, lounged in the chair by the pool, stretched out, his lean muscular body absorbing the sun's rays. Her sisters, the twins as everyone called them, Camden and Eden, were lying on their stomachs on towels reading, letting the sun caress their voluptuous curves. Hell, Circe was no stranger to curves or voluptuousness. She had that market cornered with way more curves than she'd ever wanted when she was a teen. These days, though, she appreciated her curves, relishing every inch of her body. She rolled over, pushed her sunglasses down so she could let Marco see her eyes, see the anger within. Deep within her, her elemental, Albani, sizzled with fury. Albani was an electric elemental, and even more easily angered than Circe. Marco raised his brow and put his phone down mid-text. "You make it sound like the world's coming to an end." Circe sat up with a huff. "You don't think there's a problem? After all the—" Near the pool, a light bulb shattered. Then another. Circe breathed deeply to gain control of Albani's anger, her own anger, before they had to spend a fortune replacing the bulbs Albani was destroying. The twins put their magazines down and looked at her, a question in their eyes. They didn't know her full history with Mae. She'd never shared. The only one she'd shared this with was Marco, a panther shifter elemental hybrid just like her. All four of the Brazos siblings were shifter elemental hybrids. Rare in the world. Even rarer to have them be in the same family. It was no surprise the Order of Elementals had put the Brazos siblings in charge of the Order's business, a business that was highly secretive, but crucial to shifters who found themselves with an elemental residing within. Elementals had been known to kill their shifter hosts, and then they would move on, finding another host just as they did with humans. But with the longevity and power of shifters, it made the relationship tenuous at best. Unless the shifter and the elemental could find a middle ground. No easy task. That's where the Brazos siblings and the Order of Elementals came in. Circe, Marco, Camden, and Eden were specialists at this. So they were the powerhouse of the Order, and led by Circe as the firstborn. She wants something, you know. Circe was still on the same topic. The topic of Mae. Mae. Circe fought back a sneer. "Yes, she does," Marco answered. Fury surged within Circe. Her skin burned with static electricity, making tiny crackling sounds she couldn't control. Betrayal seethed within her, disappointment in her brother. "You talk to her." She let the words come from between her lips in a staccato. "You talked to her." She sucked air in and closed her eyes against the anger. "I answered the call." Marco's voice was clipped. "We are the Order. We have a duty. A sworn duty," he reminded her. Circe opened tortured eyes, her dark gaze tormented by the past. "Yes?" She nodded, then whispered, "We do."
Chapter 2. Lincoln Avila, lion shifter and business mogul, leaped out of his bed, his lion snarling in his head. The screams were horrific and high-pitched. He didn't need time to realize what they were and where they were coming from. Dina, his niece and now his charge since her parents had both perished, was in her room, screaming. A few long strides made short work of the distance between his room and hers. "Dina." He kept his voice low and comforting, so as not to alarm her more than she already was. The first time this had happened, he hadn't known, had overreacted, and had found himself surrounded by a ring of fire. Torn between comforting her and grabbing the fire extinguisher from the hall, he'd opted to put out the fire, though he'd suffered some burns on his legs and feet. "Dina, baby. Uncle Link's here." He scooped her into his arms. Her dark eyes were a testimony to the hell she lived in her mind and body. She looked around as if confused, then focused on his face. "Uncle Link?" "Yes, baby. I'm here. It happened. She wants me gone. She hates me. She's going to kill me." He pushed her wild bed hair away from her face. I won't let that happen. You know I won't. You know it. How can you stop it? She doesn't come around when, she gulped air in, beginning to hyperventilate while at the same time growling. Her tigress, eager to protect her, was pushing for a shift. He saw the amber and gold flames flickering in her eyes. Dina, listen to me. I know how to stop it. I've heard there is someone who can help. Who? Her little girl voice, all of 4 years old, sounded more like a baby's voice with a fear that clearly enveloped her. Some people, baby. Don't worry. I got this. And he did. He would put aside all hate and all prejudice to make things better for Dina. She was all he had, and by damn, he'd do his best to protect the little dark-haired, dark-eyed beauty who was all that was left of Link's brother. I got this, he whispered, more to himself than to her, holding her tightly as he made for the rocking recliner in the game room, knowing he was in for a long night of cradling his niece and keeping her calm so she didn't burn down the house around them.
Chapter 3. Gathered in the boardroom at the Order's mansion, Circe tuned out her siblings while she flipped the pages of the file before her. She forced her mind to concentrate on the task at hand and not on her traitorous cousin Mae. The file contained the information on an incoming arrival at the Order. A little girl, a hybrid. The child's name was Denaria Avila, called Dina. She was a tigress, fire elemental hybrid. 4 years old. Circe studied the picture of the little girl. Twinkling bright eyes with a gleam of amber in their depths. Her tigress was definitely dominant. Circe wondered how that played out with the elemental that was housed within the child's body. The smile was innocent, her cheeks plump and full with the ruddy glow of health. What an endearing child. She thought of the hell that the child might be going through, with the elemental and the shifter battling within her. It brought to mind Circe's own childhood. The days of playing with Mae. Carefree days, before she took on the responsibility of the Order of Elementals. Before she removed Mae from her life. Earth to Circe. Circe glanced up at Marco, then smiled. Sari was reading. She covered up for her foray into the past. He nodded, but his eyes told her he was not the least bit fooled by her excuse. Camden and Eden are flying out. They're going to take care of the twin girls. Circe nodded. Twin girl bear shifters, barely older than toddlers, recently found to have elementals within. A perfect case for Camden and Eden. What about your case? She tried to remember what Marco was working on, but for the life of her couldn't get Mae's impending arrival to leave the portion of her mind that wasn't devoted to the case she'd be taking care of. No update, Marco said. She nodded. A knock sounded at the conference room door. Marie poked her head in. Marie was so much more than an administrative assistant. She was their right hand, their mind sometimes, Circe thought. There's a cutie here. A little one called Dina Avila. The one who brought her isn't half bad either. She wiggled her eyebrows suggestively at Circe. Circe frowned. Marie had never, ever commented on the attractiveness of either an applicant or an applicant's parent before. She gave Marco a glance. He shrugged. Okay then. Circe shoved the papers back into the file. Time to find out what sort of havoc the tigress and the fire elemental were wreaking on the little one.
Chapter 4. Link studied the mansion before him. Yup, this was the right address. The gated driveway, with a punch code that had been provided to him, had granted him entrance. He'd pulled the rented Continental through the manicured garden, resplendent with trees, bushes, an assortment of flowers, and a large pond with a fountain. The place had an ancient air, and yet it had an air of hope. Burgundy bricks, intermittently spaced with brown ones, lent an ambiance of careless architecture that was too symmetrical to be truly careless. 2 large chimneys poked out from each end of the building. An even larger one from the center. Rows and rows of oversized windows would allow sunlight to fill the rooms. The second floor was smaller than the first, permitting several balconies to jut from the majestic structure. Or maybe that's just wishful thinking on my part. He pushed that thought away, and glanced at his silent niece next to him. She was taking everything in, wide-eyed and close-mouthed. "This is it," he said with a smile, hoping to coax her from her seriousness. She nodded. He wondered if that was Dina nodding, or her tigress, or her elemental. He'd heard you could talk to the elemental within someone, but he'd never seen that. He'd heard they were a different entity. That he also couldn't testify to. And the person he'd heard that from? Yeah, that would be his dead brother. And he couldn't exactly go to his brother for confirmation on this. "Are you ready?" Another solemn nod. He held back the sigh that fought to come out in a large exhaled whoosh. "I sure hope this works." It better. It was his very last option, of that he was sure. He let himself out, then opened the door for Dina, and held out his hand for her to take it. She shook her head and reached out with both her arms. Link picked her up, and she buried her face in his neck. "I'm sorry to worry you, Uncle Link." She was trying to put forth her best attempt to fully pronounce the word uncle. "You don't need to be sorry about anything, Donaria Avila. Not a single thing." In his mind, he cursed the fates that put this little girl in the conundrum she was in. The same conundrum her dead mother faced. The same one that got his brother killed. Tapping on the remote, he locked the vehicle and strode for the polished wood double doors in the center of the immaculate pebble driveway. Whatever this operation was, it was well funded. He'd barely knocked on the door when it opened, and for the first time in his life, Lincoln Avila was speechless. More than just speechless, his jaw had probably dropped to the floor. Before him, the most stunning brunette with dark eyes and a figure that wouldn't quit appraised him coolly. Her eyes flashed with golden highlights, and he'd have sworn it looked like electric sparks in their depths. Full lips curved into a polite smile. "Mr. Avila." He nodded, while he fought to get control of his tongue and his lion. Indeed, he fought to control the lion within his mind that had begun to roar the moment she'd opened the door, rendering Link almost incapable of hearing. He struggled for power over his shifter animal, which was at the moment making it quite clear that the woman before them was unlike any woman he'd ever met. To say this was unusual was an understatement. Link's lion was impervious to females, allowing Link to flirt and cavort, enjoying his fair share of the opposite sex while maintaining a distance. Hell yeah, this was more than extremely rare for his lion. It was damned unheard of, and it was damned unnerving. It didn't help that the attraction Link felt for this woman was overwhelming. Finally, seconds later, though it felt more like an eternity, he had it under control. "I'm Lincoln Avila. This is Dina." A finger under Dina's chin, he tipped her face toward the woman. "And you are?" "I'm Circe." And wouldn't you know it, she had the name of a minor Greek goddess. Though this woman was anything than minor. He'd never presumed to understate her. She was a full-blown in-the-flesh goddess. Damn. Then he remembered the mythology from ages ago. Circe. The one who turned Ulysses' companions into pigs. Damn was right. "Hi, Dina." Circe patted Dina's back. A heat flowed between Link and Dina. A film of perspiration made its way to his temple. Not good. Not good at all. She was doing her fire thing. He gave Circe a look of consternation. Circe must have known or sensed. She backed up slowly and, nodding, opened the door wider. "Why don't we go into a special room to visit? We have a great playroom," she told Dina. Then she looked at Link and added, "And it's fireproof, as well as any other kind of proof we could manage. It's been set up to neutralize." She paused and added, "To neutralize effects." "Got it." He followed her, reminding himself he was there on business, and kept his eyes on the back of her head, not the long dark hair that swayed with each swish of delectable hips. "And what the hell is up with me? Since when do I do this?" His lion roared in response. "Pipe down." Circe led them down an opulent hallway past several doors, until she came to the last one on the right. "In here." She reached for Dina. Link frowned. I need to talk to her privately, Circe said. Dina looked between Link and Circe, then went to Circe's arms. Why? Link asked. Dina, why don't you play with some of these toys? Circe knelt and put Dina down in front of a large pink toy chest. She opened the lid. The box was full of stuffed animals. Circe rose to her feet and approached Link. Follow me. The room next door has a two-way mirror. You can watch our conversation. It even has a speaker. You can listen in. Link glanced at Dina, playing with a pair of stuffed alligators, one pink and one blue. He was reluctant to leave her. I've got to. It's for her own good. He followed Circe out of the room, to the next door, taking a seat in an oversized plush chair and waited. In the room he'd just left, Circe knelt next to Dina and began to play with her. He studied Circe while she visited with his niece. His mind began to wander while the two of them played, not really talking about anything that drew his attention. Link wondered if Circe was a shifter. He felt confident she was, but she wasn't letting off the vibes that he usually got when he was around another shifter. Maybe my shifter radar is off. Link couldn't have said later what it was that caught his attention, but something did, because suddenly he began to tune them in. What did she just say? He listened more closely. Circe was talking. When my elemental. Link didn't need to hear anything else. Why the hell was Dina alone with an elemental? What the hell is wrong with me? He couldn't trust elementals. At all. He flew out of the chair, out of the room, and yanked open the door to the room Circe and Dina were in. You didn't say you're an elemental. He noticed his lion's presence in the gravelly, growling tone of his voice, but it wasn't like it was something he could control. Elementals were too dangerous. Dina wasn't safe with one. Circe sprang to her feet, a confused look on her face. Her eyes flashed, tiny bolts of gold sparkled in the depths of her dark irises. Circe stared at him as if he'd lost it. What? The air between them sizzled. Link fought to control his lion, struggled to keep the shift from happening. Behind them, Dina crab-crawled toward the box, stopping when her back was against the wooden side. A pair of hands grabbed Link from behind, turning him around. Link found himself faced with an equally large-sized man, whose dark features were drawn into a scowl. Are you threatening my sister? Marco? No, Circe exclaimed. It was a bit too late. Reflexively and instinctively, Link's lion began to emerge, the bones in his body signaling the approach of the shift with their signature creaking sounds. A ring of flames appeared suddenly, engulfing the man that Circe had called Marco, singeing Link at the same time. Jesus! Link jumped forward. Pushing his lion back, he grabbed a sobbing Dina and wrapped her in an embrace, turning her face away from the flame she'd created, and the man who'd leapt out of the middle of the ring of fire the little girl had surrounded him with. It's okay, Didi. He soothed his little niece with the nickname her father used to call her. It was not okay, and now more than ever he could see it.
Chapter 5. Marco held Circe's arms. Calm down. I will not calm down, Circe ground the words out. Marco and Circe were in the private room, 2 doors down the hallway from the room where Dina had started the fire. They'd left Lincoln Avila and little Denaria in another room, a bit farther away. Marie was busy directing a cleaning crew in the smoke-filled room. Have one of the twins handle this case, Circe said. Eden? Let's have Eden do this one. I'll take her place and work with Camden. Marco shook his head. Circe. No. They're heading out. The operation they're on is their specialty. They're the only ones who can handle it. You know this. You said it yourself when we got the file a couple weeks ago. Circe's body was trembling. Electricity coursed throughout her system. Marco jerked backward and released her immediately as the surge traveled to his hands. She scowled. You take it then. Me? No. I'll have to leave for the airport shortly. I won't be back for a couple days. Circe couldn't take her mind off the man who'd barreled into the room, interrupting her and Dina. Lincoln Avila. There was something haunting about him. She'd seen it when she'd first opened the door, but she'd shoved her reaction to him away. She had Denaria Avila to worry about, not some hot, incredibly hot man who looked like he lived with ghosts and was a lion shifter. A lion shifter who almost attacked her. And what was that about? Another thing, Denaria, who was only 4, had actually started a fire around Marco. She was exceptionally powerful. The last time Circe had encountered an elemental as powerful at such a young age. She pushed that thought aside. She would not think of Mae. She would not think of that time when both she and Mae had been 4 young cousins, playing together in the backyard at. Circe couldn't even remember where they'd been playing when she and Mae had gotten into a scuffle over a doll. Except that when 2 little girls who housed powerful elementals in their bodies got into a scuffle, electrical sparks flew and hail rained down with a fury from the cloudless sky above. And that was exactly what had happened. Mae's and Circe's parents had come running out and snatched the girls. Mae's elemental had been creating spikes of ice and piercing the earth about them while Circe's electric bolts had pummeled the same ground. That had been the beginning. Tumultuous. The ending had been equally tumultuous. Circe hurling accusations and lightning while Mae countered with ice spears and blame. Both had shed tears, grown women long past that childhood, best friends for years. Circe pushed the memories to the recesses of her mind, shut the pain out of her heart. She thought of Dina. That child needed someone who could help her, and in her heart, deep down, though she was unwilling to admit it, Circe knew she was the one to help. But she'd have to stay away from Dina's father, Lincoln Avila. See? Marco was using his pet name for her. Damn him. Her brother knew how to pull her heartstrings. She let out a small sigh. I'll do it. And she would. She had to. This was her calling. Circe knocked on the door to the room where Lincoln and Dina Avila waited, then turned the knob and walked in. Lincoln looked up from the chair he was in. A sleeping Dina rested in his arms, her face a bit paler than it had been when they'd first arrived. How is she? Circe asked. Wiped out. He glanced down at the little girl. Circe took that moment while he wasn't watching her to study the man's face. There was something broken there. Mind your own business, she cautioned herself. As if I don't have enough issues of my own to deal with. I can't be fixing a man. He raised his eyes to hers and her breath hitched. There was a predatory gleam in the depth of his gaze. She was wrong. This was not a man who needed fixing. This was a dangerous, wounded lion. And you know what dangerous, wounded lions do to the ones who get in their path, she issued herself a warning. Her panther snarled a response. They both knew that a wounded shifter was a dangerous shifter, and though she couldn't see Lincoln Avila's wounds, she knew they cut deeply. So, he said, cutting himself off abruptly. She waited. Was that the start of a sentence? He raised a brow. Okay, maybe it wasn't. Well? His tone was a bit more insistent. I'll help your daughter. Dina's not my daughter, he said softly. She's my brother's daughter. Where's your brother? A natural question to ask, Circe figured. His jaw muscles worked. Geez, every part of this man was hard muscle. She waited patiently, watching a flurry of emotions pass over his face as he pondered whatever it was he had to say. My brother's dead. So is Dina's mother. He let out a labored exhale, then continued. She killed my brother, then herself. She was an elemental. My God. Circe leaned against the doorjamb as the horror of what Lincoln Avila had just told her sunk in. Now there was no way she could walk away from this little girl. I'm sorry, she whispered, knowing the words were so inadequate at conveying the emotions she felt, but there was nothing else she could say. He nodded. Thank you for helping Dina. I don't know what I'd do if I lost her. And Circe knew the danger was very real. The wrong elemental, in the wrong shifter's body, that could lead to exactly what happened to Dina's parents. And some hybrids, too many it seemed, didn't make it past childhood. Circe wished she could hug the little girl and take her troubles away, take them deep into herself where she and Albani could deal with them. She couldn't. But there were some things she could do. And she would. There's a room, a suite, prepared for you and Dina. I have some questions. I don't really understand the whole elemental thing. Could you, someone, explain it to me? Sometime? Sometime. He was silent. Watching. He rose from the chair slowly, holding Dina against his body while she slept. Lead the way. After settling Lincoln Avila and his niece, she was still trying to wrap her mind around that and her panther's reaction to this new development. Circe was ready for some me time. For her, the best kind was retail therapy. She knew exactly where to get that. The mall. Ain't no men at the mall, her inner voice reminded her. With my history, men are the last thing I need. Grabbing her wallet and cell phone, she opened the door and found herself face to face with a person she didn't expect to see again, ever. Or even want to. Chapter 6. Circe. That one word slipped out of Mae's mouth just before a thread of electric current slithered from Circe's fingertips and encircled Mae's wrists, binding her hands together, searing flesh where the electricity touched Mae's skin. The rope of current grew, then jerked Mae backward. Had it not been for the muscle-bound man standing just behind and to the left of Mae, she'd have fallen to the ground. As it was, he caught Mae's backward catapult and turned a hard gaze toward Circe. Circe's elemental retracted the electric tentacles, leaving Circe breathless and spent of energy. Her panther snarled in Circe's mind. Why are you here? It wasn't a question. No, it was an attack. Circe didn't care why Mae was here. She didn't belong here. You have forsaken the order, and now you... Wait, the man behind Mae said. Circe stared at him. You're not... She struggled to remember the name of the shifter Mae had left the order for. Ah yes, then it came to her. You're not Brad. She gave him a hard look, and at the same time restrained Albani, who was raring to inflict more damage on anyone, everyone. No. He shook his head. I'm not. Circe cocked her head. Shifters mate for life. Until death. Mae's voice was quiet. Mae's tone gave Circe pause. Then it struck her. He died. Mae nodded. When? Circe pried. It was long ago, Mae said. And a part of Circe that she hadn't planned on softening did just that. For a moment she felt Mae's grief, and then anger took over again because Mae's mate had died a long time ago, and Mae had not returned to the order. Circe knew the blame should fall on herself, but at the same time Mae could have reached out. After you kicked her out? A voice in Circe's mind said. Her own voice, the voice of reason. Circe shoved the voice aside. She could have reached out. Circe fought a sigh. Her anger was not ready to subside. Her fury at Mae's decision to abandon the order for her mate still stung. What do you want? Didn't Marco tell you? I'd rather hear it from you. You want to hear me grovel, that's what you want. Mae sneered. The old Mae was back. The Mae that Circe remembered, hot-tempered and quick to speak her mind. Groveling is the least you could do to make up for what you've done. Circe stayed in place, harnessed Albani, then looked at the good-looking muscular man with Mae. Who are you? That's Doc Jake Evans. Mae released a deep breath. My mate. Circe's eyes narrowed. She leaned against the door jamb, still clearly not stepping aside, not allowing them in, keeping Albani on a tight rein. So what is it you want that Marco hasn't told me?
Chapter 7. Link couldn't have said what drew him to the window while Dina napped. Probably just wanted to look outside, to hope that nature would have a healing effect on him, calm his raging side, make him relax. He was in one wing of the expansive building. To one side, he saw the driveway, to the other, a window that faced the scenery. He'd pulled the curtain aside and admired the majesty of the mountains in the distance and the evergreen trees in the nearness. The lawn was immaculately kept, until the point where it reached the forest. The order clearly kept up with the outside of the manor, as much as they did with the inside. The room he and Dina had been put in was warm and welcoming, furnished to give comfort, and it was spotless. Whatever this operation was, it was top-notch. To the left of him, he noticed a car pulling up the driveway, coming to a stop close to the front door. A tall, husky man emerged. A shifter, for certain. If Link were to guess, he'd have thought a bear shifter, but he didn't always guess correctly, so he wasn't going to wager any money on it. The shifter moved to the other side of the vehicle and opened the door for a dark-haired, curvy, attractive woman. There was something about the woman that reminded Link of Circe. Maybe they were related. They strode toward the front door. The woman wasn't a shifter, but there was something about her, something supernatural, Link was convinced. She walked with an air of uncertainty, glancing at her companion, seemed to be asking him something. The man put his arm around her, gave her a kiss. The smile she returned after they'd parted from the kiss was tremulous and unsure. Curiosity piqued, Link stayed at the window. The two walked to the front door, the same one that Link had knocked on that very same morning. Though now, how odd, it felt like a month had passed, what with the revelations and upheavals of learning Circe was an elemental shifter hybrid, of having Dina try to set Circe's brother on fire. Link heaved a heavy breath with a near-silent whoosh. What a day indeed. He turned his mind back to the couple waiting at the door. The door cracked a bit, and soon enough he saw Circe had opened it. Even if he'd planned on looking away, seeing the body language of the brunette standing next to the shifter and catching sight of Circe's expression were enough to keep him glued to the spot. The brunette stiffened, and Circe's face had filled with an emotion he hoped she'd never look at him with. Having enhanced shifter vision allowed him to catch the details of the encounter, but not even his shifter superhearing would allow him to catch the conversation between the three. Not that much conversation was allowed to happen. Before he knew it, 2 chains of electric lightning had emerged from Circe's hands, or was it her fingertips? He couldn't have testified one way or another, because it happened so damn swiftly. The electric chains had wrapped around the attractive brunette's wrists and tossed her backward, slamming into the man behind her. It was a good thing he was there. Link couldn't imagine what would have happened if the man hadn't been. The brunette would have crash-landed into the large tree trunk across the driveway. Link hissed a response to the electric bolts. These damned elementals were ridiculously powerful. Half of him wanted to get the hell out of there immediately and head home. The other half wanted to stay so he could get little Dina help. Damn this situation. He shouldn't be the one dealing with this. It should be something his brother and Dina's mother should be handling. Yeah, well, that ain't gonna happen. It's me. Just me. Only me. Dina has no one else. Period. Circe retracted the bolts, and then the 2 women stared at one another, their mouths moving, clearly not a happy scene, telling from the set of their jaws and the frowns on their faces. Link wondered if he should dash downstairs and across the building to come to Circe's assistance, though at the same time, logic told him she could handle whatever the other woman could deliver. He wondered if the other woman was an elemental. She hadn't done anything threatening. Yet. Maybe I should go help Circe. Now, why the hell did he want to come to the defense of a woman he just met and barely knew? A woman who represented everything he hated about elemental life. He studied the man with them, the shifter man. The shifter was poised to save the brunette again, and that made Link's desire to aid Circe even stronger. Seconds later, the door opened wider, and Marco, Circe's brother and protector as Link could testify to, stepped behind his sister. Link wondered if this would bode well for the newcomers, or if Marco could deter violence and blood spilling.
Chapter 8. Circe felt Marco's presence behind her even before he opened the door. She and Marco weren't twins, but if pressed, she'd swear they were as close as twins. That's how connected she was to her younger brother. Irish twins, everyone called them because they were born less than a year apart. Of course, there was some Irish blood in their family, so that did make for some joviality at family gatherings. Though truth be told, Circe and her siblings didn't seem to make it to family gatherings nearly as much as they should. A pang of guilt at that thought pierced her, before she pushed it away so she could deal with the family, cough cough, standing right in front of her. Marco cleared his throat. "Hi, Mae." Circe was frustrated that he didn't seem the least bit hostile toward their traitorous cousin who stood before them. Marco stepped around her and toward the broad-shouldered shifter next to Mae. "I'm Marco." Then he stood right there next to Mae and Circe, facing both, not closer to one or the other, as if he was Switzerland and totally neutral. Circe seethed and gave him a dirty look. "Way to go, baby brother," she thought, but said nothing. Marco glanced at her. "I forgot to give you the details." Then he looked at Mae. "I'm sorry. It was a bit of a busy morning, never got around to telling Circe." Mae nodded. The shifter, Jake or Doc, Mae had called him, gave a nod. "Understandable. Shall we go inside?" Marco waved toward the front door, toward the interior. Circe bit back the urge to bite his arm, or even worse, strike him with a bolt of lightning and shove him out of the way for this betrayal, this insolence. Marco raised a brow, as if he and his elemental might know what she was thinking. Circe set her lips into a tight line and stepped out of the way. "By all means." She ground the words out. Except it didn't quite go as planned. When she backed up, she ran right into a solid wall of man chest and chiseled man abs. She whirled around. "Link. Things are just getting better and better." She straightened her back. "Sorry," she managed to say without the agitation she felt with the situation. "I didn't realize you'd crept up behind me." Link frowned. "Wasn't creeping. You just didn't hear me." His forehead carried the lines of that frown, but they didn't reach his eyes. His gaze held sympathy and pity. Why was he commiserating? How could he possibly know what she was feeling? He couldn't, she knew, but she appreciated the silent support he was sending her way. "I was just heading out," she said. "Marco, you can see to our guests." "There, that'll fix Marco's conniving ass trying to trap me into talking to Mae." Marco was barely shaking his head, as if trying to pass her a message without making it obvious. She gave him a grimaced smile in reward, and pulled her keys from her bag. "Now," Marco said, his tone clearly sending the signal that she would piss him off if she ran away. She tilted her head. "Yes, now." "If," Link put a hand on her arm. She tried to ignore the surge of energy that flew between his skin and hers. She jerked her gaze to his eyes, wondered if he felt it. "If you don't mind," Link continued, "I'd like a word with you." He paused, waiting for her response, and when no response was forthcoming he added, "Please." Circe looked from Marco to Link, to Mae, then Jake, then finally allowed her gaze to settle on Link again. "Sure," she said hesitantly. "What about Dina?" "Napping. I ran into Marie on my way down. Asked her if she'd keep an eye on her. You know, if she wakes up." Circe nodded. "Any of the meeting rooms will be fine." She waved toward the hallway behind her. "Actually," his grip on her hand grew more firm, "I'd rather go outdoors if it's all the same for you." It wasn't all the same with her. Nothing was the same for Circe, but it didn't seem like anyone gave a crap. Might as well go with the shifter who seemed to despise her, rather than the cousin who abandoned her, or the brother who betrayed her.
Chapter 9. Link couldn't have said what motivated him to leave the drama-free comfort of his assigned room next to Dina's and go to Circe's aid. "And it's not like she really needs my help anyway," he noted to himself. No, true. That she didn't. At all. Not if that display he'd witnessed was any indication. That little electric show pretty much ensured her status as a major player. Still, there was something in her stature that drove him to slip away from the window and out the suite door. Luckily, he'd run into their assistant Marie as she was walking by, and she agreed to keep an eye on Dina. Not that Dina would necessarily need any watching. Oftentimes after she'd calmed down following one of her episodes, she'd sleep for hours. So, he wasn't too worried about it. And Dina seemed to take to Marie as she was showing them around earlier. He'd arrived at the scene unfolding at the front door, just in time to catch the exchange. The look in Circe's eyes pushed him to want to whisk her away, save her from something that was obviously giving her grief. It's not like he was some hero in a bodice ripper romance. He couldn't exactly pick her up in a fireman's carry and haul her out of there. So he appealed to her sense of duty, and the hope she didn't hate him so much that she blew him off. Clearly, she didn't hate him as much as she hated the situation she was in. He'd held the door for her, and now they found themselves walking about the grounds, farther and farther from the mansion. Circe walked wordlessly beside him, seemingly involved in her thoughts, or whatever the drama was he'd pulled her away from. They'd meandered through the topiaries, all animals, all huge, larger than the flesh and blood creatures would have been. Bears, tigers, lions, giraffes. He and Circe came to a row of hedges, and were walking a straight line parallel to the well-groomed bushes. Finally she spoke. "What was it you brought me out here for?" "To save you from killing someone, or even getting hurt." Yeah, he couldn't say that. He paused, thought it over. "Guess I thought." No, he still couldn't come up with what to say. "Is it Dina?" she asked. "You look like you needed to get away." She paused mid-step. "You?" Her eyes locked with his. He wished he could read the expression there. Was she pissed? Did he overstep? She exhaled. "I should thank you for giving me a good reason to get out of there." He released a pent-up breath of concern. "You're welcome." He couldn't take his gaze off her dark eyes with their gold flecks that sparked deeply within. Time to probe. What was that all about? It's a long story. Not one I want to cover right now. Are you open to suggestion? She raised a finely arched brow and tilted her head slightly. What's on your mind? Seeing you naked. Damn, where did that thought come from? Geez. He shoved his lion aside. The lion roared at him for trying to blame him for something that clearly was Link's thought. Shifting for a run, he asked. Her head tilted even farther. Maybe she thought he was crazy. He forged on. It helps me to de-stress. God knew he had plenty to distress about. Dina. The elemental thing. And now, add his attraction to Circe. She was still silent. He shifted his weight uncomfortably, waiting for her to answer. A slow smile curved her full lips. I haven't done that in so long. I forgot how cleansing that can be. She walked toward a small storage building near the hedges and placed her purse inside, then turned toward Link. With a swiftness that belied the discomfort of shifting into their animal form, she transformed from a dark-haired, dark-eyed, luscious, curvy beauty to a black panther. Her ebony fur shined in the darkness. Her eyes had turned from a gold-flecked, almost obsidian color to a dark emerald hue. She raised her majestic head and filled her panther lungs with a chestful of mountain air, then fixed her stare on him, her head tilted much the same way it had when in her human form. She pawed at the grass, as though impatient for him to get his own shift on. Link took one last look at the beautiful beast before him. She was magnificent. In his mind, his lion roared his agreement.
Chapter 10. In her panther form, Circe pawed the ground impatiently and watched the gorgeous specimen of mankind before her. She yawned and stretched. What was he waiting for? He was the one who suggested they shift and go for a run. She'd forgotten how good it felt to be in her panther skin. The sun warmed her fur. She blinked lazily, wanting to bask in the sunshine, to lie around lethargically. But the human side of her wanted to explode into action, to leap and run, to remove the stress that plagued her. She raised her lip in a slow snarl, warning the man that if he didn't shift soon, she'd be on her way without him. That must have been the impetus he needed. Link's gaze was locked to hers while his eyes turned from a dark brown to amber. She backed up a pace at the intensity of his lion's stare. Her panther snarled, commiserating with the discomfort and at times the downright pain of shifting. The sounds of bones crunching and tendons stretching filled the air. It didn't take long. Within seconds he was a fully matured, full-maned lion. His fur was golden, but offset by a dark brown mane that moved with the mountain breeze. He huffed his lion's chuffing, sounding more like a lion cough, revealing his large canines, making his alpha status clear. Canines much larger than her own gleamed in the sun's bright light. His chest was massive and broad, his back rippled with musculature. He glanced around, then turned his piercing gaze back to Circe and let loose a roar that shook the trees. And with that, he pounced toward the cover of the forest full of evergreen trees. Circe followed at a quick trot behind him. Circe and Link ran, trotted, and loped for more than an hour before they stopped at a brook to drink. Link stood back while she lapped the fresh, clear water to her heart's content. She then stepped back and let him have his turn, guarding him, as bears lived in the area and they weren't the two-legged shifting types of bears. Not that one was necessarily preferable over the other. Not all shifters were good, she'd learned that from experience. She felt a nudge against her mind and realized Link was pushing her for a sink. Sinking was how shifters could communicate in their animal form. A silent style of mind-talking. She allowed for the sinking Link and waited for him to speak. Feel better? His voice was deep in her mind. Thank you. I needed that. She paused and studied his broad head, his strong jawline. Shift to human for a while? His lion's face looked slightly puzzled but acquiesced. Sure. They both shifted to their human forms. Her clothes were rumpled, much like his own were. They looked like they'd been wrestling, tumbling around in a back seat. Her cheeks reddened at the thought, and then reddened even more as she found the thought of touching him to be more than a little pleasant. Why did you want to shift? He asked her. We're still a pretty good distance from your home. We can shift back. It's just that, she paused. Should she even tell him? He didn't seem to be very fond of elementals. Oh, what the hell, he'd have to deal with it. He had a niece that was an elemental. She pushed forward with her answer. My elemental gets antsy when the panther is in charge for too long. Something undefinable flickered in his eyes, and she didn't think it was the amber of his lion. She waited for him to say something before she went any further, and stuck her foot in her mouth, not that I haven't already done that a few times clearly. So your elemental, your panther and you, the human part of you, all three of you coexist peacefully? Why is it not that way for Dina? His tone was tortured. She understood and empathized with the difficulty he'd clearly suffered as he watched little Dina struggle. It just wasn't that easy to answer questions.
Chapter 11. Link waited patiently for Circe to address his question. It was clear she was mulling it over from the array of expressions that ran across her face. Circe took a spot on a large boulder and dangled her legs over the side, just above the brook's cascading waterfall. She took her shoes off. She plucked a blade of grass from a crack in the boulder. Funny how grass can sprout anywhere, isn't it? He gave a nod and fought the urge to press her toward an answer. He needed to know what was going on. Needed to know what was happening with Dina. Link joined her on the boulder. Circe finally turned her gaze his way. He took note of the anguish in her eyes. Being an elemental and a shifter isn't easy. It wasn't easy, but it's something I've managed to get under control. He nodded, glad she'd finally gotten on with it. Elementals are like, she paused, turning the grass over and over in her fingers. Elementals are non-corporeal beings. They are not flesh and blood. They're more like spirits, I guess. They're reluctant to reveal their history, but Albani and I have a special relationship. When she said the name Albani, a flicker of golden yellow shined in her eyes, resembling lightning flashing in a dark sky. Who is Albani? He asked her. My elemental. She. Wait. He shook his head in confusion. So they are actual beings who have names. They were once flesh and blood, long ago. Circe paused and cocked her head as if hearing something. Or listening to something in her head, Link thought. What am I missing? He asked after a moment's silence. She turned back to him. Albani and my panther. She pursed her lips. Albany and her panther, what? What? Link fought hard to keep from pushing up on her. He'd seen her lightning skills and wouldn't want those turned against him, but mostly he'd seen her frailty and didn't want to be the cause of this woman's pain. His lion roared in agreement. Stifle it, Link told his lion. A long time ago, there was a civilization of gifted people. People that could cast fire, ice, electricity. Like you did, he interrupted. Her eyes narrowed, and her jaw worked as though sorting through what she would say next. Link held his breath. Shit. He hadn't meant to reveal that he'd witnessed her particular gift from his suite's window. Hopefully she'd move on and ignore it, though he could see she'd grabbed onto the fact he knew her type. After a second longer, she continued. And that group of individuals was taken hostage by another, the Barabins. They were forced to use their gifts to perform tasks for the Barabins. Tasks like making rain. They can only make rain happen in targeted small areas, so like say, over a field or two. Not enough to flood the entire world before you get to thinking about Noah's Ark and stuff like that. She gave him a smile to let him know she was kidding. And it is extremely draining to keep up that type of sustained activity. Sometimes draining to the point of death. Tears welled in her eyes. He looked away, giving her privacy, though he had to wonder, was this her elemental Albany? Or, God, he had so many unanswered questions, and each answer she provided spawned a new set of questions. But for now, he had a more pressing question. Why didn't they use their gifts to kill their captors? She turned her face away from him, and he was sure the tears were flowing. Her words were muffled when she spoke again. Because the Barabins took their children and kept them far away, hidden. And if the ones who watched the children had cause to think my people had acted out, then they'd kill the children. Her voice broke. Circe. Link put his hand on her arm. What is it that makes this hit home so hard for you? Can you tell me? Help me understand. His own voice sounded thick with emotion. Help me so I can help my niece. Help me so she doesn't suffer the same fate as her mother. Circe turned to face him. Albany's daughter was one of those taken. She clasped her hands together and began to wring them frantically. Link took her hand in his. Was she? He couldn't finish his sentence. It was as if he hadn't spoken. She went on with her story, his unposed question unaddressed. The captives were conflicted. One faction wanted to kill the captors, thereby damning their children to a certain death, while the other faction wanted to keep complying with the Barabins and find another way to free themselves. So what were they called? The ones with skills. The elementals. If the bad guys were the Barabins, what were the good ones called? Circe shook her head. That's not for me to say. Do you know? He asked her. She smiled, just a tiny one that gave a slight curve to her full luscious lips. Link looked away from the temptation of those lips before he asked his next question. Then what happened? How did they get from being a civilization to being, he waved his hand, to being what they are now? They were massacred. Ouch. He hadn't been expecting that, though he should have. For Pete's sake, how else could they have become spirits or spirit-like? And they became, was he supposed to call them spirits? He changed direction. What happened to the children? So, while the adults were attacking the Barabins, the captive children weren't exactly inactive. Albany's daughter was a teenager. She was the instigator behind an uprising. The children killed their captors and went back to find their parents and instead found their corpses. Shit, he hissed the word out. What a thing for children to find. With the aid of witchery, Albany's daughter led the children and managed to resurrect their dead parents. But it wasn't without a cost, and they couldn't resume life in their own bodies. So they traveled, and still do, body to body, for an eternity. Who the hell knew? Link leaned against a tree trunk next to the boulder. Who would have thought this was the story behind Dina's powers? So, the elemental in my niece has a name. And a history. Circe nodded. What's the deal with being in a shifter then? Why's the hybrid thing so dangerous? Shifters aren't as easy for an elemental to control or to hide in. Sometimes humans don't even know they host an elemental. What? Really? How can that be? It depends on when the elemental enters the host. At birth, in utero, as a toddler, or even as an adult. If it happens when a human is an adult and knows how things are, how their body is, I'm not making sense. She paused and frowned. You mean if they don't know what it feels like to have someone else in them? Link tried to help her, if only to hasten her toward answering those questions that burned within him. Yes, I guess that's what I'm trying to say. If they don't know what it feels like to host another being, then they have nothing to compare it to. That's how it is for young ones. Older individuals get it. Some go crazy. Some try to kill themselves. Some do so successfully. Link got that. He totally got that. That's what happened to Dina's mother. After she'd killed Link's brother. Anyway, Circe continued. A shifter is powerful, not just physically, but also mentally. And a shifter recognizes that someone who doesn't belong is in the body with him. Or her. Circe chewed on her bottom lip. That's a hell of a lot for a person to have to deal with, Link admitted. He thought of Dina. A hell of a lot for a little girl to deal with. Tell me about it. Circe's smile was hesitant. I have a question, Link said. As if you haven't asked any yet. Her smile was more confident, more like the Circe he'd met earlier. And her smile was contagious. He returned it with one of his own. Point taken. He forged on though. He knew this was probably risky territory and quite invasive. What was that drama about earlier? The breath that she heaved came out with a whoosh. Long story, she said. So was the one you just told me, he countered. And you gave me the short version, I'm sure, and I stuck around for it. Yeah, but this one doesn't really have any impact on you. The other one, at least, casts some light on what your niece is going through. He wanted to tell her that what impacted her impacted him as well, but how the hell would that sound? His lion snarled, who gave a damn how it sounded. They both needed to let her know how he felt. How I feel. The lion roared. Fine. How we feel. How am I supposed to do that when we just met her? She'll get creeped out. You need to chill out with that territorial claiming shit right now, he warned his feline. His lion roared even louder. Link ignored him. He turned his attention back to Circe, still wondering what the drama had been about. Yeah, I know it may not be my business. But who knows, sometimes getting things off your chest can mean a lot. It can help. He knew he was being hypocritical when he said that. It wasn't like he was one to ever lean on anyone or share anything.
Chapter 12. Circe studied the man beside her. It was as if his face was chiseled of stone. He had a face that even in a resting pose, looked like it proclaimed, "Don't mess with me." His body, hard and full of muscles, added to his fierceness. But it wasn't like Circe was a wilting flower. She could take care of herself. She feared no man, no entity. She raised a brow and issued him a challenge. How about this? You tell me a few things about yourself, then I'll let you in. His dark eyes narrowed. The gold and amber flecks in their depths bespoke of his lion's presence near the surface. He rubbed his jaw, then moved his fingers up absently, tracing his lower lip, fascinating her. He'd vexed her. He'd mesmerized her panther. Circe was inexplicably drawn to the man. And so was her cat. He was still silent, his intense gaze still locked on her, assessing. Well, she prompted him. He gave a terse nod, as though she had him against a wall or stuck between a rock and a hard place. A long time ago, I met a woman. A shifter. I didn't know at the time she had an elemental part of her. We dated. We split up. It wasn't a good split. Angry and bitter, I guess, then she went after my brother. Circe watched him closely for signs of deceit or callousness. She sensed only resignation in his demeanor and wondered why. So why did she get with your brother? Maybe to make me jealous, hell if I know. She was still coming on to me when she was with him. I tried to warn him that she wasn't exactly what she appeared to be. I told him she was downright crazy. He thought I was jealous, so he cut me out of his life. His tone carried the torment this must have caused him. Circe frowned. His brother's reaction was harsh. Link brushed some dirt from the boulder. Tiny pebbles and dirt merged with the cascading water beneath them. He continued, so anyway, Brittany, she ended up pregnant with Denaria, and I never got to see her. Britt forbade it, and by then my brother couldn't really see her much either, and never without Britt being there. He'd split up with Britt before Dina was 2, and Britt limited his access to Dina. And of course, my access was still completely cut off. Circe shook her head. That's ludicrous. Why didn't someone get a lawyer or something? He didn't want to upset Britt too much. She'd said the moment he did anything legal, she'd know her mother worked for the courthouse and Britt would leave the country. With Dina. Circe hissed her discontent with the matter. Then came the day that changed everything. Britt must have flipped out. She killed my brother, then herself. Dina was left alone, unattended, no one to care for her for 3 days. The authorities contacted me. Child Protection Services had Dina, and I had no clue what to do. I was in too much of a daze, learning that Steve was dead. He grabbed a twig and snapped it in half, with a ferocity that Circe could completely understand. Like I'd let someone else raise Steve's daughter. I hired a lawyer. Took custody. Then one night, Dina damn near burned the house down, and I knew I had to get her help. And here I am. How's that for a short story? His smile was melancholy. It took every bit of her strength for Circe not to reach out and hug him. Unbelievable. Was Brittany's last name Fellows? His head snapped in her direction. How'd you know? Her mother had contacted us. Asked us to help her, to intervene, to assist her in managing her elemental and her shifter. And? There's no and, Circe said. She flat out refused all assistance. That sounds like Britt, Link added grimly. His face wore the ragged expression of one who'd experienced way too much pain. Your turn. He pointed at Circe.
Chapter 13. Link was torn. Half of him felt like he'd had a weight lifted by sharing that story with Circe. Hell, he'd never told anyone any of it. The other half of him felt like he'd just taken on the weight of the world on his shoulders. He'd shared. He didn't do that. Haven't shared since, well fuck. Since ever. The only one he'd ever shared anything with was Steve. He'd sure as hell never gotten close enough to a woman to share that, or anything. So. He crossed his arms over his chest. Your turn. The drama. What gives? How'd you know I had an electric elemental? I was in my room, checking out the scenery, when I saw you do that electric chain thing on that woman. Damn it, she'd caught him off guard. He hadn't meant to let that slip. He gave her a look, letting her know she'd caught him unaware. Her expression was unreadable. So, you came downstairs to save me. Or save her, perhaps. First off, he ticked his index finger as he gave his reply. I didn't go down there to save her. I don't even know her. Second, he ticked his middle finger as he made his point. I'd sooner save you than her. He tapped his ring finger next. Lastly, you're digressing from the point at hand. She opened her mouth to respond, and he could see the fight in her eyes. Link held up his hand. Nope. No more diversions, no more detours or questions. It's your turn to tell me your story. I already told you a story, she harumphed. Your story, he insisted. Fine. There was a pout, just barely there as she responded. She's my cousin. She abandoned the order, chose her mate over the order. She's not welcome here. What the? He was dumbfounded. What? She asked with mock innocence. I poured my heart out to you, and you give me the beats of the story with detached indifference. He shook his head in disgust. That attack you launched on her, those chain lightning bolts, or whatever they were, that was not detached indifference. That was full-on aggression, anger, whatever you want to call it. I'm over it, Circe announced. I call bullshit on that. He gave her a grim smile that let her know he was all business. Okay, she huffed and brought her legs up. She pulled her knees to her chest and held them close to her torso, wrapping her arms around them. Mae and I are cousins. We were once best friends. Our elementals were sisters. They are sisters. Albany and Benneth. Hers is Benneth. He nodded. He'd put that together, but he didn't want to interrupt her flow by telling her so. We were supposed to lead the order of elementals. Her elemental is very powerful, almost as powerful as mine. We'd been inseparable since the time we could walk and talk. And then one day, Mae met a shifter, fell in love, and decided she wanted to follow him back to Bear Canyon Valley. She stopped, stared at the trees in the near distance, studying them as though her life depended on it, as though she were unwilling to make eye contact with him. That must have been difficult for Albany. First, to lose her daughter all those years ago. He wasn't sure how long ago, but it had to have been hundreds, if not thousands. And then to lose her sister. A stunned expression crossed Circe's face before she managed to push it aside. Always on your guard, aren't you, pretty lady? He couldn't fault her for that. He was always on his guard as well. Except for a few moments ago, when he let the cat out of the bag about Steve, Britt, and Dina. It's been a difficult time for Albany. And she's grown to hate Mae, my cousin. You met her, I guess. So, that was her attacking Mae. That wasn't you. Circe nodded. I opened the door. I didn't expect to see Mae there, and Albany beat me to the punch. Literally. She pushed through me and past my panther before we could react. Guess you finally got control of the situation before she could kill Mae. I don't think she'd have killed her. If she killed Mae, she would have risked Benneth being unable to return. Whoa. What the hell does that mean? What's that? What do you mean, unable to return? Elementals travel from one body to another during death. Only during death. The host has to die. With very few exceptions. Some can travel without the release of death, but most have to have death and an awaiting host nearby to traverse to. What happens if they don't have a host? The elemental is dead. They don't wander around like ghosts, waiting for a home. They are done if they don't have a host. Dead, done, as in not able to ever return. That's been my experience. So all those years ago, what happened? When Mae met her shifter? She just up and followed him to Bear Canyon Valley. But why couldn't she maintain contact with you? With Albany? A fleeting expression of guilt made an appearance on her beautiful face before going into hiding. I told her to make a choice, and if she chose the shifter, she wasn't welcome in my life or in the order. That she was persona non grata if she did that. Harsh. You don't yield much, do you? She clamped her lips into a thin line. We need to get back. Hey, I'm not being critical. I get the feeling of betrayal. I felt the same way when Steve let Brittany cut him out of my life. She appraised him with one lifted brow, a dubious look in her eyes. I've beat myself up day in, day out, worried that Link couldn't have said what the hell prompted him to do what he did next. He'd have liked to have blamed his line, or the weather, or testosterone, or anything at all, but take the fault all on his own. And yet. He leaned in, pulled her tightly against him, and claimed her lips. That moment lasted an eternity during which he tasted the cinnamon of her lips, scented the aroma of her own reactions to his kiss, positive for sure, and the way her lips responded to his. The way she leaned into the kiss, the way her mouth opened slightly in surrender. Just as suddenly, before he could react, though he felt it in the stiffening of her body, in the rigid set to her lips. She jerked away, a fury so deep, so complete, that her eyes had lost their dark hue and blazed a dangerously golden yellow. What the? She stopped mid-sentence, crossed her arms over her torso, and shoved her hands beneath her arms as if holding them in check. The air about them sizzled as she studied him. Ribbons of electricity slithered around her fingertips, barely in control. He should apologize, but he wasn't sorry. Maybe he should be, if that's how she would react. "I shouldn't have," he began. "You're right." And with that, she was on her feet, and with a quick sound of bone, sinew, and tendons giving way to her shift, she morphed into her panther and leapt away. What else could he do but follow suit? He transformed into his lion and tried to keep up with her lithe panther, who was much better equipped to handle the sojourn through the forest at a fast pace. She blended into the shadows, a blur of gleaming darkness and flashing teeth. Every so often he'd catch a glimpse of her black fur or twitching tail as they made their way back.
Chapter 14. In her panther form, Circe was fuming. She raged through the forest, not caring if he could keep up or if he'd get lost. Of course he won't get lost. He'll pick up my scent and be able to follow. That was what shifters did, after all. She was livid, but if she had to admit it, she was angrier with herself than she was with him. Damn it. I kissed him back. She practically threw herself at him, for fuck's sake. She took no time reaching the storage shed where she'd left her purse, shifting mid-stride, thankful that she kept her shifting skills up to date. Lord knew, if shifters didn't practice their shifting often enough, they became rusty at it, slower, and it was even more painful. "Closest I'll come to working out," she noted, panting still, from the exerted effort of running through the forest at top speed. She grabbed her purse and made for the back door. She'd no sooner stepped inside, no sign of Link yet, thank goodness, and her purse vibrated in her hand. Well, not exactly her purse, but rather the cell phone in her purse. Marco. What did her brother, the damn traitor, she thought with a smirk, want now? She pushed her confusion about her submission to Link aside. She pushed her reaction to the gorgeous shifter into the deep recesses of her mind and concentrated on her brother's text. "Marco, can you join us for a meeting at 6 o'clock? She looked at the time on her phone. That was in 15 minutes. Damn. She texted a response, "I'll be there." She looked at her rumpled clothing. It looked like she'd been wrestling on the forest floor. Or making out. She forced that thought far, far away, but not before her panther snarled at her. So she pushed the panther aside as well. First, to freshen up. Circe knew better than to be surprised by what awaited her in the meeting room. Marco, of course. Mae, naturally. Mae's shifter mate, no shocker there. But there were two more in the room, seated around the table. A man, clearly a shifter. A woman. Light blonde hair. Greenish gold eyes. Clearly an elemental. But there was something else. What was it? In a quick second, Circe wasn't sure, and she wasn't going to take the time to figure it out, not with so many people around that she should be paying attention to, guarding herself against, and mostly keeping Albani under control, because she could already feel the hum of Albani's emotions ramping up. Just gets better and better, she mused, with no humor whatsoever. She forced a smile to her face, but didn't need a mirror to know it was grim at best. Circe nodded a greeting in general, but to no one specific. Everyone stood. That was when Circe noticed the light-haired, light-eyed woman was pregnant. Not that she was going to burst any second now, but she was well into her pregnancy, probably entering her third trimester. Great. She's in for a good time. "I'm Astra," the pregnant woman stated. "Kane," said the large shifter next to her. Circe fought the urge to be rude to them, guilty by association with Mae as far as Circe was concerned. Then she thought of her visit with Link. She thought of their last topic of discussion. Maybe it was time to let some things go, even if she couldn't forgive them. "Circe," she told the newcomers. "Circe Brazos." Marco gave her an atta-girl smile. Circe ignored him. He was still on her shit list, whether she had a new outlook or not. She'd have some reckoning to do with her brother. They all took their seats, pulling their chairs close to the table. All except for Marco. I have a plane to catch, he said. Oh, so now he was going to take his traitorous ways to a whole new level. He brought her here, and now he was abandoning her. She narrowed his eyes at him as he made his way around the table and then left the room. Circe, Mae's voice was soft. This is Jake's daughter. She pointed at Astra. Circe glanced at the shifter that Mae had taken as a mate. Your daughter is not a shifter. Circe stated the obvious. She's technically my stepdaughter, Jake said, giving Astra a smile. But she's as much my daughter as if she's my own flesh and blood. Mae picked up where she'd left off. You're the only one who has the skill to help Astra. Coldness still enveloped Circe's heart. I'm in the middle of a case, right now. Can't you make the time? Cain rose to his feet, put his hands on the tabletop, gripping the wood so intensely that his knuckles turned white and the wood protested with tiny creaking sounds. No sooner had the words come from his mouth than Astra collapsed, her forehead hitting the table with a loud thud. Oh God. Mae's voice broke as tears came to her eyes. It's been happening daily lately, Cain said. And each time she's out longer and longer. I'm worried about her, and the baby. And the headaches are much worse. He looked at Circe, his eyes beseeching. Please. I can't lose her. Jake took a few long strides around the table and approached Circe. Albany sizzled within Circe, worried about the shifter's intentions. Please. Don't let my daughter die, Jake said. There's a little girl that's in a bad way too, Circe told him. This bad? He asked. In the meanwhile, Cain had taken an extremely ashen-faced Astra into his arms. Let's get her to the infirmary and lying down, Circe instructed him. As they all made their way to the infirmary, Link and Dina intercepted their progress. Link looked at Astra, then at Circe, a question in his eyes. Dina tugged on Link's sleeve. What happened to the lady? I don't know, he said, still not taking his piercing gaze off Circe. She could tell his elemental radar, and alarms were going off. He had a rough enough time dealing with an elemental on a good day. Seeing an unconscious pregnant woman being carried was bound to set him on a different tangent. What a time for Marco to absent himself, she thought. Then she also had to admit Marco had his own case, and someone else who would need his attention in circumstances that might be as dire as either Dina's or Astra's. Can I talk to you? She said to Link quietly. He nodded, then turned to Dina and said, Would you like to play with Miss Marie for a while? Sure. She jumped up and down with glee. And then she added, Don't think for a second I don't know what you're doing. You're getting rid of my elemental. Circe opted to say nothing, hoping not to engage Dina's elemental in a conflict that would upset Dina or cause her shifter animal to become overprotective. Meet me in the infirmary in a few, she told Link. Will do. He took Dina's hand and led her in the other direction. Chapter 15. Circe studied the woman on the gurney-style bed, then turned to her mate Cain. So this has been happening often, this passing out thing? Well, it started with headaches. Then she'd faint every so often, but recently it's become a daily thing. That's why we're here now. He tucked Astra's hair back, caressed her forehead. On the other side of the bed, Jake and Mae stood, watching silently. Circe turned to Jake. Mae called you Doc. He nodded. True. Medical doctor. I mostly take care of the shifter community. That keeps me busy enough. He put his arm around Mae. She's got this goal of rebuilding the valley to the shifter population it used to have. Circe nodded but didn't react. This was still a sore subject for her, but it also wasn't the time to deal with her hostilities. What do you think? Mae asked. What do you think? Circe countered. Mae wrung her hands together and kept her eyes glued to Astra's face. Circe took the opportunity to study her cousin. Mae had not aged much. Shifters' mates worked that way, not much different from being a shifter actually. But Mae was showing the ravages of the stress this had wreaked on her. Finally, Mae turned back to Circe. I think she's got 2 elementals in her. What makes you think that? Mae stumbled over a few words before she finally came out with, I don't know. I'm no expert. I left here too early to know anything really. Yes, you did. This was one thing that Circe agreed with. Please? Mae's eyes flashed a sapphire flame in the dark chocolate depths, her elemental making her appearance. Please don't hold my sins against my mate's daughter. You're better than that. I know you. I know your heart, Circe. Circe wished she knew herself some days. She'd been so damned hardcore when it came to Mae's decision. She'd burned the bridge between herself and her cousin. No, Mae had been more than her cousin. She'd been Circe's best friend. I wouldn't make Astra pay for another person's sins. I wouldn't do that. A single tear breached the gate of Mae's long lashes. Thank you. Don't thank me. I haven't done anything yet. I don't know what to do. I think your suspicions are right, but I'll have to go in to be sure. A soft knock sounded at the door, interrupting further conversation. That had to be Link. I'll be right back. She slipped out the door and found Link there, arms crossed, waiting. What's going on? Well? She took his arm and moved him away from the door and down the hall. She didn't want everyone listening in on her conversation with Link, and Jake and Kane were shifters with their supernatural shifter hearing. She knew all about that. She was blessed with the same super hearing herself. They walked down the hall a bit until they reached the end. What was that about? That unconscious pregnant woman, she's got an elemental in her. Circe nodded. Maybe two. He cocked his eyebrow, a quizzical look on his face. What the hell? Seriously? That can happen? It's extremely rare. And how does that turn out? Or should I take the fact that she's unconscious as a sign that it doesn't turn out so well? I think that's a safe bet. Without intervention, it's a doomed situation usually. Intervention. He frowned and looked at her pointedly. And you're that intervention? I am. Is it dangerous? For you, I mean. It can be. Have you ever done it before? Not instigated it, not personally. I've seen it done, she told him. So that's a no, isn't it? That's a no. Why would you risk your life to do that? I'm in the order. It's my calling. Your calling sucks, if you don't mind my saying. She bristled at that. I don't think it sucks to help people. If you might die. Yeah, it sucks. Do you tell law enforcement officers that? Do you tell firefighters that? He leaned against the wall, shoved his hands in his pockets and studied the pattern on the carpeting, then shrugged. Point taken. That wasn't enough for Circe. She didn't want what she did misinterpreted. I help people. I'm going to help Dina. The day's events became a bit much for her. She swallowed back a lump of emotions in her throat and fought back the tears from her overwrought and stressful day. I help others.
Chapter 16. Link bit back the reply he wanted to make. He wanted to tell her she wasn't allowed to do that. She couldn't risk her life like that. He had all sorts of arguments against it. But he had no rights. All they had was a half-kiss, from which she pulled away as if she'd made the largest mistake in the world. What the hell am I supposed to say, by damn? The best he could come up with was, does your family know you're doing this? My family. My brother and my sisters. They're not around. All of them are out of town. And you're going to do something that could potentially hurt you. Kill you. And no one is here who can help you if you need it. What the hell are you going to do, woman? He fought the urge to grab her by the shoulders and shake sense into her. I'm going to let Albany take me to a different world. Into a different world. What does that even mean? Albany and I will go into the realm where Astra's elemental, or elementals, reside and find out what is happening that is rendering her unconscious. I don't like it. She glared at him. You have no. He raised a hand. I know. I have no right, but someone should be here to speak on behalf of your family. My siblings wouldn't stop me, and they are the only family I have. What about your cousin, the one that's in there, Mae, right? If Mae weren't willing to have me do this, she wouldn't have brought Astra here. Anyway, the risk is not that great. Not that great. Right, he scoffed. But the results are permanent, right? You could die. Who knows what happens if I get trapped there? Maybe I'll be alive, but there. Link, why are you doing this? All I wanted was for you to not worry about things, because I could see that once you caught sight of Astra unconscious, you were worried about Dina and what could happen to her. I am. But how could he tell her he was worried about her too? How could he tell her that yeah, I sound like a damned idiot now. He fisted his hands in his pockets to keep from punching the wall. Or something. You're damned hard-headed, aren't you? She gave him a smile that made him want to kiss her. His lion roared in agreement with that sentiment. I've been told I am. Whoever told you was right. How the hell did he start caring so much for her? When his lion snarled, he ignored him. His lion had been going on about the whole fated mate thing. Link wanted to tell him it was bullshit, that it was a fairy tale. But then, how do I explain how I feel about her? How about I play the role of your family just in case? Oh. That brow of hers quirked again, and was accompanied by a sassy little smile. You're my brother now? He bit back a response about how the thoughts he had about her were anything but brotherly. Anything but, by damn. So, what is it that you propose to do as my family member? Well, I can help make decisions that involve you if you're not able to. She laughed. It will be fine. Don't worry. But you're welcome to sit in, if you promise not to let what you see taint your opinion of elementals or of what Dina needs. What do you mean? I mean, I don't want you pulling her out of here before I can help her. She put her hand on his arm. Link felt a surge, the same surge he'd felt when he kissed her. A tidal wave of emotions flowed over him. Promise you will give Dina the chance she needs not to end up like Brittany did. Well, fuck. When she phrased it that way, of course, he'd do whatever was needed to help Dina. I won't take her away. Promise it. You have my word. She nodded and turned to go back to the room. One more thing. He cleared his throat while he sought the words that were evading him. About earlier. She raised a hand to halt his words. It happened. We can forget it. I'm sure it didn't mean anything. Oh, but it did. He'd not muddy the waters with that right now, but sometime she had to see that it meant something.
Chapter 17. Circe let the lying words fall from her lips. She'd flat out lied. That kiss touched her in a way she hadn't thought possible, in a way no kiss had ever before. She'd watched Link walking away. That kiss between them had given her doubts about how she'd treated her cousin Mae. If what Mae had with her mate was 1/1,000,000th of that, then Circe could understand that the connection she'd had to that shifter had been so unlike anything Circe had ever thought could exist. But Circe couldn't tell Link that. So she lied. She let the words come out with the ease of a seasoned con artist. Guilt ate at her. She glanced back and caught Link watching her, his expression unreadable. Tonight? Jake said. You want to start tonight? While she's still unconscious, yes. I think it's the optimum time to do this. Kane shrugged. I'll have to yield to your expertise, as I'm in uncharted territory when it comes to this. You're a medical doctor, Circe continued, addressing Jake. You can take care of any needs she or I have. True, Jake added. How can I help? Mae asked. This one's on me, Circe told her cousin, walking to the other side of the bed. She took Mae's hands in hers. When I am finished, when we get Astra to a stable place, I have an apology to make. Tears filled Mae's eyes. You don't. I've never stopped loving you. 1,000 times I've thought to ignore your demand that I never come back. I've thought to ignore it, and come here and hug you. As if to drive the point home, Mae wrapped her arms around Circe. Wait. Circe pulled back and put her hands on Mae's shoulders. Save this for later. I'll need all my wherewithal and concentration for this. Mae nodded and kissed her on the cheek. I love you, Circe. I've always loved you, Mae. Circe walked back to the other side and took a seat next to Astra. Monitor Astra's vitals, she instructed Jake. Jake nodded. On it. Circe wasn't the one who would actually do anything. This whole thing was up to Albani. Since learning during her teen years that Albani could traverse dimensions and join other elementals, she'd never endeavored to actually perform the procedure. She'd been warned that it was dangerous and shouldn't be attempted unless under dire circumstances. She'd also been warned that before she did any such thing, she had to be sure she had a solid relationship with her elemental. It had been explained to Circe that if her connection with Albani was at all in jeopardy, there was a risk that she wouldn't come out alive, or that she'd be stuck in that place forever, which wasn't unlike death really. Circe hadn't discussed this with Albani. She wouldn't. She didn't want to give Albani access to some of her inner thoughts, the deepest, darkest doubts she had, that maybe Albani had not forgiven her for pushing Benneth away when Mae had chosen her shifter mate over the order. Circe had swept that under the carpet and avoided the subject all these years. She was going to keep avoiding it and hope that Albani was happy to have her sister with her. Albani had been one of the high priestesses of their people. She'd been one of few. And she'd been the most powerful, Albani said. Circe looked at Mae, Kane and Jake. None of them knew what to do if anything happened. Then again, neither did Circe's siblings, but at least they had elementals that were used to working together, that maybe could help figure out something. Oh well, she thought. Here goes nothing. Her panther snarled, not happy with the idea of turning control over to Albani. Albani and Circe's panther had an on and off again tenuous relationship. The panther was extremely protective of Circe, and Albani didn't always agree with the panther's influence. In her mind, Circe tried to soothe her panther to convince her there was nothing to worry about, but she knew what the panther knew. If Albani decided to go rogue, she could easily leave Circe stranded in a place she couldn't get out of, and by default, the panther would be in the same place. Circe took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and in her mind wrapped her arms around her panther's neck, whispering words of comfort. She kept her eyes closed and looked at Albani. The high priestess was tall, slim, dark-skinned. She wore the robes she'd always worn when she'd been flesh and blood, robes of a crimson color so red as to actually be like a river of blood. Albani's eyes were an obsidian hue, widely placed, and offset her high cheekbones. She looked at Circe with a haughty, regal demeanor, her hands emerging from the robes, tiny sparks emitting from her fingertips. Circe nodded to her in her mind. Albani returned a single nod, just a bare tip of her head acknowledging Circe's surrender of power. Circe said a prayer. Here we go, she thought. Here we go. She took Astra's motionless hands in her own, and laid her head next to her hands, next to Astra's slightly swollen baby bump. In her mind she released herself, yielding to a silence and a floating sensation. Circe had traveled this way once, long ago, when she'd first learned that she could do this. Circe had been under the tutelage of her mentor, Susanna, a hybrid elemental shifter. Susanna had shown Circe how she transcended and traveled into another being with the help of her elemental. She'd held Circe's hands in her own. Next, Circe felt the tug on her mind, felt herself being pulled. And then, it was as if she was a tiny paper sailboat in a tub of water, and the drain had been pulled. Chapter 18. Circe remembered well the first time she'd ventured into an elemental's world. At that time she'd felt herself spiraling, and before she knew it, Circe, Albani and her panther were walking in a forest, and next to Circe was Susanna, Circe's mentor, Susanna's white tigress, and Korabe, Susanna's elemental. The six of them were all in a thick forest with a low-lying mist that came to Circe's knees. She'd spent that time with Susanna, their elementals and their shifter animals. That had been more than a decade ago. That had been before Susanna had vanished, surrendering the reins of the order to Circe and her siblings. Now Circe was going to, hopefully, do that with Astra, what Susanna had done to her. She'd visit her in her elemental's world. One of Astra's elemental's worlds anyway. She had very little experience with dual elementals. Heaven help me. I hope I can return to this world. Her panther snarled softly in the background. One of Astra's hands twitched. Eyes still shut, Circe focused on the sensation. Then with a sudden swish, without any warning or preamble, she spiraled into a fall and crash-landed into her panther with a muffled whoosh. Her panther turned around and rubbed her head against Circe's shoulder. Flesh. Flesh and blood and fur. Circe had arrived. She glanced around to get her bearings. Albany stood above them. Circe had forgotten how tall the priestess was. She stood nearly 6 foot tall, all elegant neck and slim arms with chiseled features on dark skin. Albany studied Circe and her panther's undignified sprawling position with dispassionate eyes. Circe rose to her feet, her panther did the same. Being alone in her own body and her own mind was something Circe had very little experience with clearly. It was a surreal feeling, and clearly not one she was accustomed to. To say that it was normally crowded in Circe's mind and body might be an understatement, but it was something she was familiar with. So now she felt alone, and maybe a bit lonely. She reached out and put her hand on her panther's shoulder for comfort and solace, letting her fingertips bury in the thick fur, relishing the feeling of the muscles rippling beneath her touch. Albany watched the exchange with an air of disdain. Maybe Circe could understand Albany's emotions. If she'd been through what Albany had, royalty in a civilization that was conquered and essentially destroyed by a lesser civilization. Maybe if she'd never been separated from her children. Maybe if she'd never lost a sister. There was plenty of reason for Albany's aloofness, but Circe's passionate, impulsive nature couldn't relate to it. Nor could her panther. Where are we? Circe asked Albany. In another world. Albany's tone was calm, cool, unfazed. Circe looked around. Whereas when Susanna had joined Circe, Albany and her panther in Albany's world, a world of forest and fog, this world was completely different. Someday Circe would have to ask Albany the logic behind the worlds that each individual had, and what determined those worlds. This world was very different. This world was mountainous, but of the rocky variety. Crags with sparsely growing shrubbery rose in the near horizon. Sheer rock-faced cliffs and canyons surrounded them, flat-topped plateaued hills rose from the canyon floors like stoic sentries. Is this the Grand Canyon? Circe made a complete circle. Our worlds are not, Albany paused as though searching for the right words. They are not the worlds you live in. Where's Astra? And her elemental. 2 elementals, Albany corrected Circe. Much as suspected. Do you know these elementals? They have not made an appearance yet. Do we go looking for them? We won't have to. Albany pointed. In the near distance, 3 figures approached. In the middle, Circe could tell that one was clearly Astra, her light blonde hair gleaming in the bright sunlight. She was flanked by 2 individuals, both attired in sapphire-colored robes, both taller than Astra by a good 6 to 8 inches, and both with long ebony hair that whipped about the faces in the brisk wind. Circe glanced at Albany. Albany's face was drawn, consternation etched on her typically emotionless face. What is it? You know them. Albany's nod was slight. Nevena, the one on the right, is an earth type. The other one, Ahe, an electric elemental. Something bothered Circe. She couldn't explain how she felt it, but she was certain Albany was holding back. What else? They were both high priestesses. When the Barabins took us, they were with me in the same tent. Later, much later, Ahe took a Barabin as a lover. Had his child. When the uprising happened, Ahe's child was killed. Circe sighed at the horror, then wondered out loud. Ahe saw this? Albany nodded. She did. The Barabin father had taken the child to his own tents, and not allowed it to live with Ahe. When there was an uprising, the uprising that led to the massacre, Ahe's child was one of the casualties early on. Nevena was the one who killed the child. She created a seismic tremor that spawned an earthquake, swallowing up the Barabin tent the child was in, a nursery for all Barabin children. Circe gasped. She killed Ahe's child. And now they are in the same body. A body that held an unborn child in its womb. Could this get any worse? She learned it could, very quickly. When we attacked the Barabins, Ahe did not simply fight on our side, killing Barabins. She also killed Nevena's family. All but the children, who of course were out of our reach, being held in a secreted place by the Barabins. So now why this what? Circe couldn't finish her sentence or her thought. She was still trying to wrap her head around the history. Ahe has been looking for Nevena a long time. And now it seems she's found her. Is Ahe more powerful than you? I haven't seen her in ages. She was equally powerful as I. Now I don't know who is more powerful. There was a tone that Circe couldn't decipher in Albani's voice. What is it? Albani sighed. I cannot harm her if that's what you want of me. But she is harming Nevena, right? She does want to kill her. She's always wanted that. On occasion, when I was in a different, what was the word you used with Link? Albani paused, reflected, then continued. Yes, when I was in a different host, I had occasion to visit with others of my kind. Ahe has one mission left. One alone. To kill Nevena for killing her child. Were you close to Nevena? Did you know her well? Albani's smile was sad, did not reach her eyes. Nevena was a friend. Ahe is a cousin. Circe hissed a reply. No words, just a shocked hiss, expelling the air in her lungs, stunned. Why is it that you cannot harm her? It goes against the edicts. If Ahe kills Nevena, she will be brought to justice. If I kill Ahe, I will be brought to justice. Justice? Define, please, because I'm of the flesh and blood world, and for the love of all that is holy, I can't understand how beings like yourself can be brought to some sort of justice. You have no lives as I know life to be. You can't be prosecuted. And yet, we too can be killed in the sense that we are forever removed from the ability to enter anyone. We can be locked away in a permanent death, a void where we cease to exist. A single tear snailed its way down Albani's angular face. There is no good ending here. To save my Nevena, I have to kill my cousin, which means I will sacrifice myself. If I don't stop my cousin, Nevena will die. Her smile was grim. And now you know why I was reluctant to play the role that Susanna and her elemental wanted for you. I knew this day would come. Her shoulders rose and fell with a sigh. It was true. Early on, Albani had been reluctant to join Susanna in another world. The three figures approached, within yards now. At Circe's side, her panther snarled a warning. Circe comforted her with a firm hold of the fur on her withers, running her fingers along the musculature in loose circles. Heavens, she thought, please let my panther keep her temper on a tight leash. When the three were close enough to practically shake hands with Circe and Albani, they stopped. How are you, Astra? Circe tried to keep things casual and on a low-key level. Astra rubbed her belly. Not bad considering. I think the baby's fine. These two, she waved toward Ahe and Nevena, have been battling since. She heaved a sigh. Since forever. First one's winning, then the other. I think they'll kill me before they kill each other. Circe gave her a smile of encouragement, hoping that Albani could sort this mess out. And your headaches? I don't have one right now. How are you here? I don't understand. She rubbed her eyes, as if not believing what she was seeing. I thought I was dreaming, but I don't think I am. She looked about. Or am I? This is not a dream. I'm here with you in this world. A world with Ahe and Nevena. Ahe's eyes narrowed, then she turned to Albani. You told her my name? Albani inclined her head. You're here to stop me. Ahe's tone had a clear challenge to it. You know I will not harm you, Albani. I only pursue her and her relatives. Ahe, if you kill her, they will send the reapers after you. They have not done so yet, because all of the others were not like this. Albany waved to their bodies. Now that we are non-corporeal and unable to procreate, to further our lineages, to keep our kind from going to extinction, they are not so forgiving. You'll be hunted. You'll be taken. Yes, but I will have achieved my goal. But then our numbers will be reduced by 2, Albany pleaded. Her by you, you by the reapers. Albany reached out to take Ahe's hand, but before she could make contact, a river of electricity traveled between them, pushing Albany back, then snaking around to wrap a noose encircling the neck of the still silent Nevena. The noose rose into the air, pulling Nevena, stretching her until she was dangling, being hanged by the electric rope about her throat. Nevena's face turned pale, then a shade of blue mixed with lilac. The panther roared. Circe yelled no. The ground rippled beneath them, then shuddered, and a schism opened, pulling Ahe off her feet. The electric rope released Nevena, and became a lifesaver for Ahe, keeping her from falling in the slash in the earth. Ahe threw her other hand up, sending a bolt toward Nevena. Albany flicked her wrist, and offered her own bolt, intercepting Ahe's, sending it in a downward spin, where it pierced a large boulder, and looked more like the mythical sword of King Arthur's time, only it didn't resemble Excalibur, it was a lightning bolt embedded into a boulder. Albany's bolt retracted, returning to her, as though it were a living creature going back to its master. Jesus! Circe took a step back. The panther stayed by her side. I'm so out of my league here, Circe whispered. The panther's soft growl was one of agreement. These were powerful entities, and killing her or Astra while they were trapped in this world would be an easy feat. Astra's fluorescent greenish-yellow eyes were wide with fear. She ran next to Circe. I don't even know what to do. They fight inside my head, one of them will kill the other and then kill me too. We won't let that happen, Circe whispered. Ahe laughed, the sound mirthless. And Circe realized the helplessness of her statement. The utter futility of it.
Chapter 19. Link had been in turmoil. When Circe headed to the infirmary to attend to the unconscious blonde, he had 2 choices. Walk away from her or walk toward her. Of course, walking toward her meant one thing. It meant eavesdropping. And he knew that would piss her off. But hey, it's not like he hadn't done that on a semi-regular basis since he'd met her. Damn. It had only been a day, no, a few hours ago. How the hell did that woman get so far under his skin that he couldn't imagine a day of not being around her? He shook his head. Pathetic. His lion roared. Again with you. Shut it, he warned his lion. So he faked walking away until she'd rounded the corner. And then he crept, slowly and with stealth, down the plush-carpeted hallway toward the frosted glass door of the infirmary. He stayed to the side, careful not to be in view of anyone who was near the door and might see a silhouette skulking in the hallway. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing, skulking. Me. Skulking. Unbelievable. What had he come to? He reached the glass door well off to the side of it and leaned against the wall, waiting, listening. No sounds came from the room within, though he knew there were several people in there. The unconscious Astra, Cain, Mae, and Jake. And Circe. And yet not a sound. He was itching to go in. Itching to see what was happening. He thought of ways he could see, maybe an outside window. Maybe a vent in the ceiling. Okay, I'm being utterly ridiculous now. The door opened and his heart stopped. Jake looked right at him. Why don't you come on in here instead of waiting outside? He smiled. We have chairs. Link nodded. Thanks. And what did he find inside? Astra on a bed. Cain and Mae on one side, in chairs. On the other side, Circe, leaning against Astra, her eyes closed. Is she okay? He whispered to Jake. I guess it's sort of like meditating. That's the only way I can describe it. At least on the outside, it looks like meditation. But she's not really here. She's with Astra. Link had no clue what the hell that meant, but he was glad he could be in here, rather than being outside and not knowing what was happening. Circe twitched once, which made everyone in the room jump to their feet and hold their breaths. Jake jumped in, checking first Circe's vitals, then Astra's. He looked up from that task and nodded, adding, "They're fine. For now." Link didn't care about the caveat. He'd just rather they were fine, period. 6 hours later, Link was still awake and it was close to dawn. He wasn't ready to leave, but he had to wonder if Circe was uncomfortable. "Maybe we should pull up another one of those beds for Circe, make her more comfortable." Kane frowned. "Will that hurt her or disrupt anything?" Jake gave a short headshake. "Not sure how this works." He glanced at Mae. "Don't look at me." Mae shrugged. "This is not my area of expertise." A soft knock came at the frosted glass door. Marie opened it with one hand. Her other hand was holding Dina's. She had a nightmare. "Thought I should bring her down before anything erupted into flames." Link gave her a terse though appreciative smile, then turned to Dina. "Bad dream?" "Couldn't sleep," Dina said, crawling into his arms. "Is Miss Circe going to be okay? She doesn't look so well." "She's fine, honey. Just fine. Maybe resting a little bit." "Then why is she bleeding?" Dina pointed toward Circe.
Chapter 20. Ahe's eyes had a shark's dead expression. Circe had seen this before. She'd seen it in an elemental she'd been working with. One that went insane and committed suicide during the night. Circe recognized the hopelessness in Ahe's expression. There'd be no bringing her back from the ledge of homicide or suicide. She sidled closer to Albani. She doesn't intend to live through this. And she doesn't really care who she takes out with her. Albani agreed with a tiny nod, not taking her eyes off Ahe. "But it is still my duty to try. I can do no less. And if something happens to you..." Circe didn't want to finish that thought, because if something happened to Albani, Circe wondered if that would mean something would happen to her panther and herself. She glanced toward her feline, and found her studying her with a glittering emerald gaze that had a measure of intensity. It was as if the panther knew Albani's success and well-being would determine their well-being. And Astra's. And Nevina's. Circe's shoulders had slumped with the weight of the pressure. She stiffened her spine. This was not the time to give in to weakness or emotion. This was the time to be determined. Circe swallowed the lump of anxiety and turned to Ahe. "Is there nothing we can do to dissuade you from your path of destruction?" Ahe looked at her, as though she was studying a lesser species. "What do you know of destruction, human? Without the cat, you'd be rendered to dust in less than a second. We are immortal beings that have no concept of time. But you were once mortal. You once had feelings, felt love, had a child." Ahe's eyes grew hard at the mention of a child. "I had a child. Ahe pointed to Nevina. "She killed my child." Tears sprung to Nevina's eyes. I've told you, I didn't know, I wouldn't have done that. You supported actions which would have had all our children killed." Circe looked at Albani. "She endangered your own daughter?" "She did." "Whatever happened to your daughter?" "You said she rose and led a group that killed the Barabins that had killed your people." "Then what?" "Then nothing. She has not been seen since then. I've looked." "You have not looked hard enough." Ahe spat out the words. "Who are you to judge me?" Albani's tone was cold. "You're a bitter creature." "Then perhaps after I end Nevina's miserable existence, I'll end yours, then I'll hunt down your missing daughter and end hers." "What makes you think you can find her when I could not? Did it occur to you she might be hiding from you?" Ahe's smile curved wickedly upward. "Why would she do that? Maybe she doesn't know that you wouldn't kill her. Maybe she doesn't know who to trust." Albani shook her head. "I don't know why she'd think that. Maybe her head has been filled with information about that day." Albani cocked her head. You've seen my daughter? You've talked to her? Perhaps? A low humming noise came from Albany, alternately buzzing and sizzling. You know where my daughter is? Ahe studied her long fingernails, turning her wrist this way and that. This has become a boring conversation. Damn you. Answer me. A flash of electricity began to form into a funnel cloud in the sky above Albany. Ahe flicked her nails, sending a current of electricity across the distance, lassoing the funnel cloud, then forming a net that closed in and minimized the cloud to a minuscule size no larger than a fist, then tossed it into Nevina's chest. Nevina opened a hole in the ground with a flourish of her hands, then sunk under the path of the electric torpedo. Albany's eyes flashed with a surge of nature-driven anger. Oh shit, Circe thought, taking Astra's hand and stepping away from the two women. Her panther stood her ground, not following Circe. Circe tried clearing her throat so the panther could notice and join her, but all the panther did is look back, then turned her full attention on the two elementals. Nevina was still submerged in the hole she'd created in the ground. Chapter 21. An electric aura surrounded Albany. Golden and sizzling, it swirled about her torso, crackling and popping softly. A low hum of a growl came from the panther. Circe wondered what the feline could feel or see or hear that she couldn't. Ahe raised her arms to the sky. So it comes to this. My daughter. Albany's voice brooked no argument, no surrender. It was pure demand, pure leadership. This was not a question. Ahe's eyes narrowed at the threat Albany presented. Her wrists twisted slightly, her fingertips extended. A rope of electricity flew out of her fingers, surrounded Albany, then reached toward Astra and Circe, winding through the air much like a living gigantic serpent. The panther roared a warning and sprang toward Ahe. Ahe's eyes flared, her jaw tightened, and she lowered one hand, splitting off the serpentine electricity, creating a second one that snapped and whipped toward the airborne panther. Ahe's secondary serpentine electric bolt twisted on itself, then grew a whirling blade, pulled a 90-degree shift, flipped and embedded itself into the panther's side. Blood splattered. Circe screamed and leapt toward the panther. At the same moment, the ground began to shake. The fissure Nevina was in expanded, then a rush of soil erupted from the center of the fissure. On it stood a weak and pale Nevina. The panther fell at Circe's feet, bleeding profusely, the ground becoming a muddy crimson mess beneath her. Circe turned to Albany for help, but found the elemental encased in a web of electric that Ahe had woven about her. Helpless in her human form, watching her panther's wound drain her life force, watching Ahe's electric web rendering Albany into unconsciousness, Circe released a blood-curdling, soul-wrenching scream. Ahe turned her attention her way, and raised her hands, pointing one at the still-rising Nevina who stood on the crest of soil surrounded by the fissure she'd been in. Ahe aimed the other hand toward Circe, sending a flurry of electric bolts in her direction. Astra shoved Circe, causing her to fall below the aim of the bolts. Circe had no idea from where her panther pulled the strength, but the feline struggled to her feet and surged toward Ahe, latching onto her arm, clamping mighty jaws, severing tendons and muscles, then collapsing at the electric elemental's feet. Ahe glanced down at the panther, then at her non-functioning arm. She raised her good hand and sent a cascade of the same electric bolts toward the panther. No. Nevina snapped her fingers. A wave of soil rose from the ground, creating a barrier that protected the panther, barring her from the barrage.
Chapter 22. Link fought the adrenaline and worry that threatened to send his lion into a headlong rush to figure out what was going on. Jake had already leapt to his feet and was checking on Circe. It's not her blood. How can that be? Link asked. Jake shrugged. Mae contributed her best guess. I think it's because they're in Astra's world. Is it Astra's blood? Is she hurt? Kane's voice had an edge to it. No. Jake put a comforting hand on Kane's shoulder. Or maybe he was just keeping him from flying out of his seat. I already checked. Astra's fine. The baby is fine. Kane exhaled in relief. Circe's not hurt, Vina said. At least not yet. Her panther's hurt. Link looked down at his niece with consternation. Why, how can you know that? Dina shrugged. I was dreaming it. Then a look came over her face and her voice changed. Albani is hurt. Nevena is weak. The panther is wounded and bleeding. Dina's voice had a deeper timbre. Her eyes glowed with a red flame in their depths. Link had a feeling he was talking to Dina's elemental. Mae and Jake strode to Link's side. Mae put her hands on Dina's shoulders and looked in her eyes. How do you know these names? You are Dina's elemental. What's your name? You know my name, Dina's voice said. Tell me. Mae's voice had changed as well. Link met Jake's eyes. Mae's elemental Benneth, Jake explained. Link was dumbfounded, confused, and in his mind, his lion roared in consternation. Where's Dina? Link asked the elemental. She's yielded control to me for now, the voice in Dina said. Don't worry, I won't hurt her. Link frowned. Yeah, an elemental's word didn't hold much water for him. And don't take this personally, but I know her mother's story, the elemental said. Okay, great, Link conceded. Then you know why I'm concerned. While I got you here, tell me something. Why does Dina start fires? Or is that you starting them? She didn't answer him, just watched him with those eyes that now looked like they belonged to an older soul. What's your name? Mae's elemental asked again. Dina turned toward Mae. Renali. Mae, her elemental rather, gasped. Link was confused, but he had greater concerns now. Like how was Circe? What are they doing in there? He asked. They are trying to defeat evil, but losing. I have to help them. Link was torn. Risk losing Dina to help Circe. The hell you do. He couldn't let his little niece fight the battle of adults and ancient beings. I must, Renali insisted. They can't defeat her without help. Then I'm going with you, he said. It can't be. Figure it out. I'm not letting you take Dina without me. Mae whispered, Link, no. Link was ready to lose his shit all over the elemental, except the elemental was inside his young niece, so that couldn't hardly happen. He never got to think his next thought, because his world went dark and began to spin.
Chapter 23. A ripple in the air near Circe was felt by all, and then before she could figure out what it was, new figures stood before her. 3 human forms, a lion she knew only too well, and a tiger cub, Dina's tiger. Link, Dina, and a young woman with eyes alit with flames. Dina's elemental? Before Circe could react to Link and his lion or Dina or anything, the earth shuddered beneath her. Nevena was creating shudder after shudder, making the earth ripple under their feet. Link's lion ran to her panther, nuzzled her shoulder, and began to lick at her wounds. Still holding Dina's hand, Link sprinted to Circe. Dropping to his knee, he knelt next to her panther. He glanced up at Circe. What, are you hurt? His eyes scanned her face. No, I don't think I am. He turned his attention toward Ahe and her severed arm. She's the one who has wreaked this destruction? Yes, she told him, then looked at Dina next to Link. The little girl was watching her with eyes that knew way too much, way more than a young child should. What are you doing here? Circe asked the little girl. Dina turned her gaze toward the young woman who'd slowly walked closer to them. Renali wants to help her mother. I was wrong before. She didn't want to hurt me. First, she wanted to see her mother, see if Albani loved her. Ahe told Renali her mother wanted to kill her. Renali didn't believe her. Now she wants to help fight Ahe. So here we are. Circe's head was spinning. She was sure it was because she couldn't seem to think straight or process what Dina was saying. Whew! Circe didn't have a chance to finish her sentence. A fire erupted, surrounding Ahe. That was the moment Circe caught sight of the young woman, the one that Dina had called Renali. Renali's arms were outstretched, raised toward the heavens. Her gaze was an intense, fiery stare. Fiery. Fire. Dina? Are you telling me she's Albani's daughter? I am, the young woman said, her black hair whipping in the heated wind that seemed to have picked up out of the blue. Ahe screamed as the flames engulfed her legs. She threw her one remaining hand up in the air and flipped her wrist with a snap. A cascade of electricity dropped a solid blanket over the flames, extinguishing them. Ahe turned her attention to Circe. You are the reason this is happening. If you hadn't arrived, with that and a flourishing wave of her hand, Ahe formed an electric bolt that sizzled in the air, then flew toward Circe. Link's lion roared, leaping in the air. Link yelled, jumped forward, his body in front of Circe. Link caught the bolt with his shoulder, shattering bone, singeing flesh. The lion's leap was mighty, spanning the air. He landed on Ahe, his jaws wide. He sunk his teeth into her neck and shook his head before snapping his jaws shut with a bone-crunching sound. Silence fell. Chapter 24. Circe looked up from Link's fallen body, making eye contact with Albani. Do something, she whispered as if she knew Albani could help. Of course Albani couldn't do anything, how could she? She wasn't a doctor or a healer. Albani was simply an elemental. The fact she was powerful meant nothing when it came to healing. That power only applied to destruction. Tears welled in Circe's eyes, and she couldn't have told anyone, including herself, how this man had come to mean so much to her. Don't let him die, Albani. You have your daughter now. I don't want to lose him. True enough, Albani had her daughter. Renali was in her mother's arms, in a hug that bespoke of the absence from her mother. Link's mighty lion jumped away from Ahe's limp and lifeless body, and approached Circe's still fallen panther. The panther raised her head, her eyes still glazed from blood loss and injury. The lion nuzzled her head, then took 2 strides closer to Link and placed his broad nose against Link's chest, pushing and pushing again. Link remained unresponsive. Please, Albani. The words slipped out of Circe's mouth unchecked. Please don't let him die here. Albani nodded. And with that nod and no notice whatsoever, Circe's world turned into a spinning darkness and she was sucked into a vortex. Suddenly, things were different. She wasn't in the same world. She wasn't. Circe's eyes flew open. She was in the infirmary, her upper torso against the gurney, half laying against Astra. Thank you, Astra said softly. Her lime-green eyes fluorescent and for the first time without torment. Circe gave her a slight smile, then looked for Link. He was on the floor next to her. There was blood on the sheet where Circe had been, but it wasn't fresh. There was blood on the floor where Link lay. Oh heavens! Mae was watching the situation, wide-eyed, her hand over her mouth in shock. Jake was vaulting across the room, concern written on his face. He knelt next to Link's prone body. Circe's eyes flooded with tears. She dropped to the floor next to Jake and put her hand on Link's chest. It barely moved. Help him, Circe beseeched Jake. Kane, let's get him to the other bed. Jake was grabbing a black bag Circe hadn't noticed in the corner. Kane nodded and stooped to pick up the lion shifter. With what seemed like little effort, though Link was no small man, Kane and Jake moved his still motionless body to the bed. What happened? Mae asked. Circe shook her head to stifle the sounds of her panther roaring with concern over Link and his lion, and the sound of Albani's voice. She couldn't even concentrate on what Albani was saying. A small hand tugging on Circe's own, and brought her attention down to Dina. The child was pulling on Circe's fingers. We have to help Uncle Link. A fiery red flame flashed in Dina's eyes, and then her elemental Renali spoke. We will help Lincoln. Mother, you have to help us help him. Somehow, she said to Albani. Albani screeched at Circe to give her control. Circe was no child who could not control her elemental. She refused to give up her dominant position, pushing Albani back. She told her this was not the time. I have to be here for Link, she told her elemental. Circe. Jake touched her arm gently to get her attention, a concerned frown bringing his brows downward into a V. He has to hibernate, to recuperate. He has to shift into his lion and hibernate. Circe knew about recuperating, hibernation. She knew that was the one thing that could save a shifter who was close to dying. Is he close to dying? She didn't want to contemplate that, though at the same time, she couldn't have explained how he'd gotten such a hold on her heart. I wish I could do something to help. Astra's voice was filled with sadness. I feel like all this is my fault. It's not, Circe told her. It started long before you. It's been in motion for hundreds of years. You were simply the vehicle Ahe chose. Please don't concern yourself with that. She didn't tell her that what she should concern herself with was whether or not Link would make it. She didn't want to lay that burden on Astra's already tormented, guilt-laden heart. I want you to concentrate on your baby and yourself, while I try to figure out what can be done. But Circe knew she couldn't figure this out alone. She needed help. She was mentally ready and able to turn to Albani for insight. What can be done, Albani? She asked her elemental. Circe could only hope that Albani had answers because she, herself, had no clue how to get a shifter to morph into their shifter animal when they were unconscious. Albani's voice resounded in her mind. You could shift. Stay near him. I'll keep watch while you're in your panther. But your panther is wounded. You know this, do you not? Circe remembered her panther being wounded in the other world, but does that mean she's wounded still? She asked Albani. But Circe knew the answer to that. She knew her panther was hurt, could tell from the faint heartbeat that seconded her own. She started to ask Albani a question she didn't want the answer to. She took a deep breath and finished her question. Could she die? My panther? And if she did? You know the answer to this. Albani's voice was sad. Yes, if the panther died, Circe would too. It may not be as fast as Link was fading, but it would happen. Shift, Circe. Let your panther out. Let her hibernate and heal. I'll keep watch. What about Link? Trust him to do what is right for his lion. He's holding on to his human form because of you. Trust your instincts. When did you become so wise? Circe asked Albani, though she knew that a being as ancient as Albani had learned this over time. It was no coincidence, she was so knowledgeable. Circe looked at Mae and Jake. Keep watch. But outside, please. She wanted her privacy. Mae nodded. Circe took several blankets from a cabinet and laid them on the floor. She glanced at Jake. Jake nodded at Kane. They collected Link and lowered him to the pallet of blankets she'd placed on the floor. She sat next to him. Thank you, Circe whispered to Mae. We'll be close by. Mae took Jake's hand. Kane put his arm around Astra, and the four of them made for the door. Circe turned her attention to Link. His chest still barely rising with every breath. Here we go. Circe took a deep breath and mentally prepared herself for the discomfort of the shift. Her bones creaked, the sound loud in the silent room. Sinew and tendons pulled and stretched as her torso lengthened and her chest expanded. Her facial structure ached with the widening of her cheekbones. Fangs erupted in her gum line, leaving tiny traces of the taste of blood on her tongue as her teeth realigned. Her legs stretched out, her arms too. She huffed a panther sound, then nuzzled Link's body, pushing a velvet nose against his human side. She breathed him in deeply, and her panther sighed a long exhale. In her panther form now, Circe could tell how wounded her panther was. She apologized in her mind for putting her panther through such hell, and for not being aware how wounded she really was. Her panther chuffed once, low, letting Circe know everything was fine. That she'd need to hibernate, but not until she could get Link to shift into his lion. Circe hushed, knowing the bond she had with her panther was strong, that she needn't have worried about that. I'll keep a watch. You need to hibernate, Albani told her panther. Circe was floored. In all her years, Albani had never worked with the panther, never communicated with her, barely acknowledged her presence. Albani continued talking. You saved us. Without you and Link's lion, we wouldn't have succeeded. And my daughter is with me. It's time for us to end this feud between shifters and elementals. And if we can't end it for other shifters and elementals, let's at least put it to rest between us." Circe was choked up from the conciliatory gesture of her elemental. Her panther huffed a series of agreeing chuffs, then laid her head next to Link's wounded shoulder. "He will shift and hibernate if he knows you are. His lion will be able to sense it and will take over." Circe's panther closed her eyes and surrendered herself to the deep darkness of hibernation, becoming unconscious and vulnerable to the world around them.
Chapter 25. Link couldn't have said what woke him up. He was in his lion's body, and next to him was a beautiful black panther. Circe. His lion stretched slightly, his powerful neck moving his maned head closer to Circe's panther. He inhaled deeply, taking in the scent of her. Woman and panther mixed together, sitting on his scent glands. His lion let out the tiniest of snarls, a sound of pure happiness. Link's shoulder ached, but just slightly, a reminder of the battle they'd been engaged in. He couldn't remember exactly what happened, but he knew his lion had killed the elemental that had gone crazy. What else could describe the way that elemental was attacking everyone? She'd lost it. He wondered about the history of it, and hoped that Circe would clue him in. Lying there, next to Circe, he reflected on the power of the elementals housed within the only two females he'd ever loved. His niece and the panther shifter next to him. Yes. Love. He acknowledged he didn't understand the emotions for this woman that flowed through him, but they were there, and they were real nonetheless. He couldn't live without her. Now the question was, how would she feel about him? Would she spurn him? Would she help Dina, and then send him away so she could work on her Order of Elementals assignments? His lion's pulse raced at the thoughts crossing Link's mind. A roar was building in his lion, and Link was concerned that the roar, if released, would shake the very room they were in. "Chill," Link cautioned his lion. "We'll work it out." The lion didn't respond, but his heartbeat began to normalize. Next to Link, Circe's breathing changed. Her body moved, her panther's muscles twitching as she slowly pulled out of her state of hibernation. She stretched, her panther's body lithe and muscular next to his. One forearm rose, and her paw was suddenly pushing against him, and then draped across his lion's body. Link didn't know if he wanted to push for a sync to create a link for them to communicate in their shifted forms, or if he should let her wake up. He bit back his eagerness to reach out to her, and this was no easy feat, for his lion was equally as enthusiastic. He needn't have worried about pushing to sync with her, for not more than a few seconds later, he felt Circe's panther pushing against his mind, seeking to establish a connection. He quickly let her in. "You're awake," Circe said. Her voice penetrated his mind, infiltrating its way into his chest, wrapping his heart in a vice-like grip. Oh yeah, this woman had definitely become something he wasn't sure he could live without. "I woke before you did," he teased her. She snarled, "Then, how do you feel?" "Alive." That's it. Just alive. That was definite concern in her voice. He wondered if that was a professional concern, or something more. How could it be anything more when she'd rebuffed him after their kiss? Then again, he hadn't imagined her reaction to their kiss. That was very real. Not just alive. "I feel fine. We were afraid you might die." He had the same concern, but he wasn't about to tell her. "I'm not ready to die." He switched the topic. "What about your elemental, Albani? And her daughter? And Dina?" She didn't answer him right away. Then came that all-too-familiar sound, the sound of bones and musculature giving way to her human form. He didn't wait for her to finish her shift. He quickly began his own, morphing into his human body swiftly to catch up to her. He studied her human face. She was pale, a clear indicator of what they'd gone through, but her dark eyes were flashing with the presence of her panther and her elemental. "Albani is fine. You can talk to her any time you want. She can come out." They were lying on a pallet of blankets, next to one another, facing each other. Her hair was messy, had that bedhead look. Or that freshly fucked look. Oh hell, Did he really go there? Did he really think that? You bet he did. He couldn't tear his eyes from her face, the planes her cheekbones and strong jawline created. The way her eyes cast downward, her lids hiding her emotions when she caught him watching her. Link couldn't have told what happened, but it happened as quickly as a switch being flipped. 1 second they were waking from hibernation, the next the air about them sizzled with chemistry. And no kidding, it sizzled. There were soft hissing and popping sounds about them. Albany, he asked her. Is she causing that? Circe nodded, her eyes still down, her emotions still shielded. Link put a finger on her chin and tipped her head upward. She resisted his finger, her muscles in her neck expanding slightly as she pushed back and didn't raise her head. Hey, he said gently. Stop that. Without moving her head, she raised her lids and locked gazes with him. Stop what? Stop making this so goddamn hard, woman. Why does everything have to be a battle with you? A golden light flared in her eyes, followed by a dark flame he knew was her panther. This woman was strong. No meek little lamb. He took her hands in his, raised them above her head, and half leaned across her. Trapping her body, but not fully, not threatening to take her freedom, just offering a slight view of what it would be like to not be totally free. She chewed on her bottom lip, but said nothing. Did nothing. She was as still as a statue. He could see a battle inside her. Something raging between Circe, her panther, and her elemental. He let that battle rage while he took in the scent of her, the sight of her. He could wait it out. He could wait until this woman and her other factions determined what she wanted. But he wouldn't wait forever. Not without acting on what he and his lion wanted.
Chapter 26. Circe wasn't going to tell Link what was on her mind. She wasn't used to being vulnerable. She wasn't used to not being the one in control, in full charge of all aspects of her life and her heart, and in full custody of her elemental and her panther. But now the elemental and the panther were battling her for control. And it didn't help that her heart was on the side of the elemental and the panther. The only one that was standing on the sidelines alone and without an ally was Circe's mind, or rather her pride. Her pride insisted she not give in. Her pride insisted she didn't need a man, didn't want Link. Her heart denied this, but when had her heart ever won? She'd always been the hard one. The one that pushed Mae away. The one that never yielded. The one that ran the order of elementals with ruthless and precise organization. Pride. Circe took a deep breath. Where had pride led her thus far? What did she have to show for her pride? A mutiny occurred within Circe, and it was one she never anticipated. Her heart, with the aid of her panther and elemental, shoved her pride aside momentarily, and though Circe couldn't have said later how the mutiny happened, her heart took over. She appraised the man before her. His dark good looks, his sculpted cheekbones, strong jawline, and wide shoulders. He was muscular but sleek, built like an athlete or a predator. His dark eyes with their amber flare, his lion, were alert, his body tense as if ready to spring into action. Her gaze traveled to his lips. Full, but not vulnerable, sensuous, and sexy at the same time. And then? What the hell happened? Yet another thing Circe couldn't have answered. She wrapped her arms around his neck, her fingers buried in his hair, her nails scoring his scalp. She brought his face closer while bringing her own up to his. Her lips alit on his with the ferocity of one denied. She tasted the man of him, the lion of him, musky, earthy, and sexy. She couldn't have named the flavor, but it was uniquely Link. Circe wasn't allowed the luxury of leading the kiss. Link's mouth claimed hers, his tongue exploring, his lips pressing. He moved his body slightly, until she was ensnared beneath him. She'd never felt so trapped and at the same time so free. She felt her body relax into this kiss, as his weight settled on her. How long did that kiss last? Forever. And at the same time not nearly long enough. He raised his head, his eyes gleaming. What changed? What happened? She swallowed hard, thought of how to answer. My panther. Albany. She gave in to a slight shrug. So, what are you saying? A wicked gleam shined in his eyes, an equally wicked smile on his lips. That this is some sort of menage thing? She scoffed. Not a chance, mister. It's me. All me, only me. His laughter was soft against her ear as he nuzzled her neck. That's all I want. Nothing more.
Chapter 27. Link would have said more. Would have kissed her more, except the door opened. Mae peeked her head in. Jake's outline was behind her, barely visible behind the frosted window. We thought we heard voices, Mae said. Circe scrambled out of Link's hold, a delightful splash of color blossoming on her cheeks. Link fought back the urge to laugh at her embarrassment. You did. We're up. How long were we out? The door flew open and Dina rushed into the room, wrapping her arms around Link while her eyes focused on Circe. Link could clearly see the red flame of Renali's eyes in the depths of his niece's gaze. Uncle Link, you've been asleep forever, Dina exclaimed, peppering his cheeks with kisses. Day and a half, Jake translated with a laugh. And she's been a handful. Just raring to come in here and wake you. Nah, Dina denied. Then added, well, maybe a little bit. Dina turned to Circe. How are you? And this time, it was Renali's voice asking her mother. Link wondered if Circe would allow Albani to step forward. He received his answer in a few short seconds when Albani said, I'm well. And happy to see you. The voice, so different from Circe's, was choked with emotion. Dina hugged Circe, or rather, Renali hugged her mother. I don't want to lose you, Albani said. I don't want to be apart from you either. Link, uncomfortable with the display of emotions and the heaviness of this, focused his stare on Mae and Jake. Mae had tears streaming from her eyes, so really there was no escaping the emotions for Link. Kane and Astra entered the room, Astra looking refreshed and glowing in her pregnancy, a far cry from the shell of a woman she'd been before. Thank you, Astra said. And Evana thanks you as well. She was supporting her stomach, her hands making slow circles over the baby. Thank you doesn't even begin to cover it, Kane added. We are forever in your debt. Jake coughed and turned away. Link got it. He was overwrought with emotion about his daughter being saved. Circe untangled herself from Dina's embrace and rose to her feet. I hope you can stay for a while, she said, taking Mae's hands into her own. Please. We have so much to catch up on. I can, Mae said. And there's another who needs help, Mae added. More than one, actually. Who? Circe said. Astra stepped forward. My childhood best friend's mate has a daughter who is a hybrid. And that's not all, Mae added. There's an infant in Bear Canyon Valley. A boy. He's got an elemental as well. I had no idea you had any elementals around you, Circe said. And here you have 3. Link cleared his throat. I suppose the honeymoon can wait. Honeymoon. Dina squealed. What? Mae's hand flew over her mouth in surprise. Circe looked at Link, a quizzical expression on her face. Jake cocked his head. I'm lost. That makes 2 of us, Circe added. I guess I hadn't exactly done anything formal. Link said. Are you? Circe never had the chance to ask her question. Her lips were sealed with a kiss. In the background, Dina was laughing and jumping and clapping with delight. And no one was sure if it was only Dina, or if this was Renali's joy at having her mother nearby. If Circe accepts, Link thought. If. Chapter 28. A week. Had it only been a week since he'd brought Dina to Colorado? Link and Dina had stayed, of course. He said he wouldn't have dreamed of separating Dina's elemental from her mother. That he'd have found a way to make that work. Luckily, he didn't have to. Circe didn't want him to leave. Though she was hellishly confused. He'd said honeymoon, but that was where it ended. Was he speaking crazy talk from being wounded? Or teasing? She didn't understand. They'd been staying in separate rooms, naturally. He was in his guest room, she in her own, but every now and then Link would slip away and join Circe in her room. Not that they did anything. They just talked. And talked. And she wanted him more and more. Yet Link didn't push her. She couldn't figure out what was going on. Where was the man who kissed her in the forest? This morning, she thought of surprising him. Her feet moved with stealth as she snuck toward his room, her heart pounding harder and harder with every step, until it felt like a bass drum in her chest by the time she stood in front of his door. Why am I so nervous? You'd have thought this was my first. First what? I'm not finishing that thought. Knock or don't knock. He always rapped on her door softly with his knuckles. Should she do the same? She didn't get a chance to answer that question for herself. Link's door opened, and he stood before her, a crooked smile on his face, making his gorgeous face even more handsome, if that was possible. They stood toe-to-toe, staring at each other. Then he placed his hands on her arms, and her skin sizzled with electricity under his touch. Damn that Albani, taking over my reactions. I've wanted to kiss you, he whispered. Again. She thought of the first time, and how she'd reacted so poorly. And then she thought of the infirmary, and how great it had been. And then nothing. For a week. She drew in a shaky breath. You should. He pulled her into his room and closed the door softly. Circe tilted her head. God, he was so much taller. Link's hands moved up her arms until they rested on either side of her face. She held her breath, waiting as he came closer. Her lungs burned from the effort. But he did nothing. Just looked at her, his eyes locked with hers, as if he could see deep inside her. Circe let the air out without a sound, and drew another shaky breath in. Then it happened. He lowered his head. And when he touched his mouth to hers, a sigh escaped between her lips. He tasted amazing. Like he had in the forest. Like he had on the floor in the infirmary. Need simmered in her body, crackling through her veins. She wrapped her arms around his neck, melting against his hard body. She belonged to him. There was no denying it. Not for her. She thought he felt the same way, but a whole week without a kiss, or even more. That wasn't the kind of signal that meant a guy wanted to keep a girl in his life. He swooped her up as though she weighed nothing, carrying her to her bedroom, where the window revealed the trails of lilac and pink as the sun began to make its appearance. Circe kicked her sandals off as he made his way swiftly across the room. This was it, wasn't it? Was it? Was that what she'd read in his eyes? It was happening. It was really happening. And she wanted him so fiercely. Her desire for him was so strong, it echoed through her body, bouncing off her senses like an electric basketball. He laid her on the bed. She stretched out wanting him. He lowered himself onto her. He kissed her again, deeply, slowly. Circe ran her fingers through his hair, sighing in pleasure as he explored her mouth, while his hands took the liberty to reconnoiter the rest of her. She wasn't interested in playing hard to get. She wrapped her legs around his hips, drawing him closer, relishing the hardness of muscles above her body. She was lost in the moment, when abruptly it ended. He pushed himself up, taking her with him until she straddled his lap. With one hand, he held her in place while with the other, he tugged on her nightshirt, a long flannel thing, not sexy but very demure and comfortable. And on a chilly Colorado night, Circe was all about comfort. She raised her arms, allowing him to lift it over her head. He cupped her breasts in his hands, fondling, as his tongue lapped at the tender hollow of her neck, then traveled downward to her chest. Releasing shallow breaths, Circe reached for the center of her front clasp night bra, and snapped the hooks apart, then shed the flimsy fabric quickly, eager for more of his touch. It was bliss, and she felt herself slipping away as her body took over for her mind. It wasn't just her body. It was instinct. Nature. Circe unbuttoned his shirt slowly, eyes focused on the width of his chest as she revealed it, sexy inch by sexy inch. It was like revealing a marble statue, but a statue that emanated heat. Marble that flexed and moved. Once the shirt was open, she placed her hands on his broad shoulders. Her breath caught at the sensation, the electricity that smoldered between them and within her. She slid her hands along the rippling muscle of his shoulders, then down his arms until the shirt was completely off. Circe couldn't believe her eyes. She thought she'd imagined his body looking so delicious, all bulging muscle and hard sexiness. She told herself it was all lust, a reaction to a life of more abstinence than sex. Nobody looked like this, nobody could look so good. All those magazines and photos online, those were all photoshopped, right? And yet there he was, right there in front of her, a statue come to life. Like a Greek god. Could she have stopped her hands from reaching for him? Not a chance. She had to touch, had to know he was flesh and blood, real. Link lowered her to the bed again, and she took her sweet time exploring his chest and chiseled abs, before moving toward his pants, sliding them over a sculpted ass and thighs. She bit her lip, hard to keep from telling him how unbelievable his body was. He was gorgeous, glorious, and all hers. For now. She wasn't sure what the future held exactly, but she wanted this morning more than anything. Her fingertips pirouetted over his chest, his abs. Just the feeling of all that hard muscle, and knowing how powerful he was, made her want him more than before, knowing he could do anything he wanted to her, and she had no interest in stopping him. She would not deny herself. That knowledge was so hot, her entire body responded. Her hips rose, feeling his hardness pressing against her aching mound. She pulled him closer. She dragged her tongue over his shoulder, biting gently as he kissed her neck. He tasted just as good as he looked, salty and musky. So good, too good. Better than she could have ever imagined, even in her wildest fantasies. She felt like a caged beast, seeking release. I want you. The tortured words left Circe's parted lips. Link shifted his body, adjusted, and then immediately placed his shaft against her mound. He released a groan and it drowned out Circe's own moan. She scored her nails over his broad back as a growl filled the air, her cry of desperation. Link was like a drug she already couldn't get enough of. Her body was primed for him, ready, as if she'd been waiting for him forever. She slipped one hand down between their bodies to show him what she needed, taking his hardness in her hand. He threw his head back and snarled in response. That snarl shot a surge of desire and electricity through her body. Circe shook as she stroked his length. He was hard, thick, almost too much to get her fingers around. The sensation of the power in holding him just so, of bringing him pleasure, was heady. She flicked her tongue over his lips as he trembled above her, completely at her mercy. She feared for a second that she wouldn't be able to take him inside, he was so large, but at the same time she knew she wanted to. She wanted to feel him fill her, even if it meant it would hurt. Link grunted, his hips moving as though he couldn't stop driving himself through her grip. He bent his head, kissing her, his breath coming faster and faster as his hips moved. Their mouths crashed together, tongues dancing, breath mingling much the same way their cries of pleasure did. He groaned, pulling himself out of her grip. We'll see how much you like that kind of sweet torture. Before she could ask what he meant, he hooked his thumb under the elastic of her panties. She gasped, frozen. He stopped, looking down with concern. Everything okay? He whispered. Sorry, it's just. We don't have to go any further, he whispered. She heard the strain in his voice. She knew he meant it, he'd stop. He just wouldn't like it very much, but he would if he had to. That, almost more than the deep throbbing in her core, made her want to go further. I want to. What she wanted to say was she needed to. She pulled his face to hers, kissing him deeply to show him she meant it. She wanted all of him. She was apprehensive. The vulnerability of not only giving him her body, but also her emotions. But in bed, half naked and painfully aroused, wasn't the time to deal with those apprehensions. He gave her a nod, his expression concerned and tender, and at the same time, lust flared in the depths of his eyes. He worked her panties down to her ankles. Circe held her breath, but didn't make a move to stop him. He was tender, gentle, as he ran a hand up the outside of her leg until he reached her thigh. She released a soft sigh. It was wonderful, the way he touched her. She opened her legs, inviting him to more of her. He growled deep and low, his face close to hers while his hand found her heat. Circe gasped, driving her hips upward, desperate for relief, and his growl turned into a soft laugh. "I love it," he whispered with a wicked smile. She closed her eyes as he stroked her mound without dipping any further inside. Didn't he know she would perish if he didn't touch her? If he didn't give her what she needed? If she didn't get relief? "Do you want me?" he whispered, his fingers gliding over her moist folds. "Yes, please," she begged. "Tell me what you want," he commanded, his tone firm. Damn him. Was he going to make her beg? She didn't beg. "Link, I need you." She looked up at him, letting her eyes do the pleading, practically near tears but refusing to make her lips say the words. "1. Don't beg." He smiled, satisfied, and sank his fingers deeply inside with a fierce thrust. He worked her throbbing flesh, stroking her, until she was in a frenzy and everything came to a single shining peak. She cried out, clinging to him as fireworks exploded behind her eyelids. She felt her body go rigid all over for that last, heart-stopping second before dissolving into shivering bliss. When things settled, she caught him watching her. She felt her cheeks get hot. "Don't," he said. It was beautiful. He shucked his briefs. He was long, as thick as she had felt. She bit her lip, wondering again if she could take him. He was so much bigger than. He noticed her face. "I'm gonna ask again. Are you okay?" She held her arms out to him, an overt invitation. He nodded and moved above her. She felt the pressure between her legs at her entrance. Pleasure started building again, a deeper scorching sensation than before. "I'm going to try to control myself," he muttered through clenched teeth. "Fuck. I am. I will." She wasn't sure if he was trying to convince himself or her. She kissed him to show she got it, that she was okay with it, more than okay with it. Link thrust once, driving himself into her, and the world vanished as a speck of pain dissolved into total rapture. She felt a climax coming on immediately at the first thrust. He grunted against her neck as she tightened even more around him. "So good," she whispered, panting with desire. He moved in slow, measured drives, smooth and deep. She rolled her head from side to side, half crazed as her body shuddered, again and again. Again. And again. Circe didn't think she could take any more, but he kept going, faster, harder. He was losing control, and she was there with him. She'd finally learned the definition of abandon. Circe dragged her nails down his back. She grunted like an animal as he took her, riding her, his muscles working beneath her hands. She urged him on, gripping him tighter with her legs, pulling him inside. Their bodies slapped together, faster, faster. Their cries mingled, muffled by a kiss to keep their secret. "Come for me again," he commanded as he thrust, driving his length into her. She thrust her hips up to meet his downward thrusts, taking what she wanted, moving closer and closer. It didn't take long for that familiar pressure to build inside her core, tightening until it exploded. "Yes," she cried out. He threw back his head and gave a groan to his own coming undone. She fell asleep before she knew it, too exhausted to speak.
Chapter 29. Circe stretched. She could get used to this. Oh, who was she kidding? She couldn't live without this. She took a moment while Link was still asleep, more like spent from their earlier activities, and studied his features. Would she ever tire of looking at this face? Never. His eyes flew open so quickly it startled her. She flinched while her heartbeat raced. "You scared me," she admitted. "I thought you were asleep." "I felt eyes on me." He planted a kiss on her lips, lingering. She tasted herself, their sex on his lips, and blushed at the image of what had happened a couple hours ago. She'd never thought that the expression writing someone's face was a thing. She'd have thought he'd have suffocated, or perhaps that it wouldn't have been enjoyable. Oh my. How wrong she was. It was so very enjoyable. "What's putting the color on your cheeks?" he asked softly, a teasing tone in his voice. She shook her head. She was no wallflower, but she wasn't quite ready to outright state what was on her mind. "Subject change?" Link asked. And she loved him even more for getting her. He simply got that she had weird moments. And he let her have them without stepping on her toes. "Yes. Subject change," she concurred. "How are things for Albani and Renali? How are things between you and Albani? Has any of this changed your, what would you call what you have with Albani, a relationship?" "That's what I'd call it. Albani and Renali are happy to have each other nearby. Albani and I get along better than ever. I mean, I thought we were good before, but now there's this definite camaraderie that didn't exist before." "Good. So that means you're happy." She wanted to tell him that having him here with her was what made her happy, but didn't want to be needy. Plus it was true what he said. Albani and Renali's proximity, and the role that Circe played in that, had brought about a new level in her closeness to Albani. "Yes, I'm happy. You didn't ask about Dina, how she's doing, how her relationship with Renali is coming along." "I don't need to ask. I can see she's doing well. And I can see that Renali being with her mother has given Renali a sense of peace that she's passed on to Dina. This is the happiest I've seen her since, ever." He paused, then continued. "Are you wanting me to ask because of plans and stuff? Is this your way of asking where this is headed?" Now it was her turn to pause. She didn't want to tell him how much he meant to her. She didn't want to tell him anything that would make her vulnerable. She cursed herself for being this way. For being so difficult at times. Link studied her, his expression unreadable. His jaw muscles were working, but it didn't seem he was angry, just thinking. Finally, he spoke. "I'm not leaving your life. I'm selling my home and moving here to Colorado. I'll put a down payment on a home as soon as I find the right one." Circe was so stunned her jaw felt like it might have dropped open. She sucked in and chewed on her bottom lip while she absorbed what he'd just said. "You don't have to do that," she answered. Link's brows rose in question. "Meaning?" "In for a penny, in for a pound." She'd heard that expression before, but never truly grasped the finality of it, the true meaning behind it. She was all in. She had to be. She'd lived her life without half measures. She was all about black and white, no room for gray areas. She needed to be the same with this, with Link. "You can stay here. I don't take handouts. I don't live off women. No one is asking you to do that. I don't do charity cases, anyway. You're needed here. Someone is needed. I talked to Marco last night. We need more help, more manpower." His eyes narrowed. "So you want to hire someone, anyone, me?" Circe took a deep breath. She needed to let him know. "Not anyone. Not someone. You." He didn't move his eyes from her face, and he didn't say a word. God, this emotional stuff isn't easy. This vulnerable stuff is hard as hell. Then Circe thought of Mae, and how if she'd been a little less hard, things wouldn't have gone sideways for so long. "I want you here." He nodded slowly, and though it looked like he was agreeing, it also looked like the kind of nod that said, "Keep talking." So she kept talking. About how Dina should be here. How it was good for Dina to be with her own kind during her early years. About how Albani needed her daughter. How they'd been apart for centuries, and it would be wrong to separate them again. She couldn't recount later the things she said, but he remained silent. Finally she summarized with, "I want you here." A slow smile grew on his lips. "That's all you really had to say. The rest was icing." Circe gave him a dirty look. "There's the Circe I know." He leaned in and touched his lips to hers. "The one I love." Chapter 30. Circe walked through the maze, letting the sun warm her face. She'd been unable to reach Camden and Eden, as had Marco. Marco tried to explain it away. They were too busy, they had bad reception in the valley of the Bear Canyon mountain range. He had all sorts of reasons for Circe not being able to reach the twins. But still Circe worried. Why? Why worry? Camden and Eden weren't babies. They were grown-ups with elementals and shifters of their own. They could handle whatever came their way. The crack of a twig snapping made her whirl around. Mae. She hugged her cousin. I didn't mean to sneak up on you. Mae hugged her back. I'm on edge. Can't reach Camden and Eden. They're working with Grizz. Why don't I give him a shout? He can give us an update. Who is Grizz? Grizz. Mae's smile was enigmatic. Grizz is. Grizz. He's been around the mountains for a long time. He has worked with the compliance units of the Shifter Supreme Council. Not sure if he was an enforcer. Not sure if I should even be talking about that. So have his nephews Cross, Lance, and Judge. He's been a bit of a mystery on the mountain range, rarely seen, keeping things rolling. Not allowing shifters and their lifestyles to go into obscurity. Circe was intrigued, not in a romantic way. God knew she was plenty happy with Link, but this Grizz guy sounded like a mystery that needed solving. Maybe I'll get to meet him when I visit sometime. Oh. Mae was practically bouncing with excitement. You've got to come visit. Just got to. I would love to show you the valley. Introduce you to the families there. Really, it's more like one big family, more than it is a series of families. I'm blessed. Circe smiled at the flush of excitement that blossomed on Mae's cheeks. I'm happy for you. Mae took her hand. But I see a sadness in your eyes when you say that. Circe studied the emerald green lawn. I have wasted so many years. So much time. We could have been together. Albany and Benneth could have been together. Ah. Mae squeezed Circe's hand. You had a road to travel, as did I. We had life lessons to learn. She shrugged. What matters is that we are here now, together. True. And we will be together. We'll make it a point to see each other regularly. Did Astra tell you the name she's picked out for the baby? Circe frowned. No. Was she supposed to? I wasn't sure if she had. What's the name? Circe Albany Mae Evans Ortiz. Tears flooded Circe's eyes, threatening to overflow. Wow. My goodness. I'm honored. She was choked up and swallowed hard to be able to speak again. She didn't know what she'd call her. So she's gone with the first initials. Cameo. Mae's face widened with a grin. Very nice. I like that. Cameo. Circe hugged her cousin, who was now her best friend again. What an appropriate name for her. I love it. You're coming to visit her when she's born, aren't you? I wouldn't miss it for the world. And you'll bring Link? Circe narrowed her eyes at her cousin. What's that? As if it's not obvious that you two are meant for each other. The only thing I don't understand is why you haven't couple bonded yet. It doesn't seem like he's marked you or claimed you. Unfortunately not. Circe didn't know what was taking Link so long either. He hadn't pressed her for a commitment. I wonder if he finds it difficult. Circe cocked her head, curiosity piqued. Why would he? Mae laughed. A genuine laugh that seemed to explode from within. Seriously? Circe nodded. Seriously. Because you're scary as hell. And no pushover. And wickedly powerful with your electric skills. But? She heaved a deep breath of exasperation. I don't think I scare him. Yeah, but I suspect he knows that as scary as you are, you're also very scared. He probably doesn't want to push you. Men. Circe stomped toward the hedges, ready to get lost from her thoughts and men and her thoughts of men. One man, to be specific. Link.
Chapter 31. Link found her in her sitting area of her bedroom, overlooking the majestic scenery of Colorado, her legs tucked beneath her, a steaming cup of coffee before her. "You're up early," he said, planting a kiss on her temple, sneaking his arm around her to grab her cup of coffee. "Thief," she accused as he raised the cup to his lips. He smiled just before he took a sip. Then he grimaced. "Too much sugar." She laughed, the sound warming his soul as she plucked the cup from his fingers and drew a drink from it. Perfect," she argued the point. He took the cup from her, set it on the table, and picked her up and carried her to her bed. She wrapped her arms around his neck, and they stayed that way as he laid her on the rumpled sheet. He planted himself next to her, and side by side, he graced her lips with his thumb, then let his hand glide lower. He slid his hand under her shirt and cupped one breast, teasing the nipple to a stiff peak. Circe moaned, her body strained closer to his. Her moan told him about the need building within her. He separated from their kiss, semi-reluctant, while at the same time need coursed through his body. Link rolled Circe onto her back, raising the shirt so he could slide his tongue in a slow circle over one dusky peak, then the other. Circe ran her fingers through his hair, holding his head close as her back arched and her hips rose in eagerness. Link explored her silky skin, peeling off her nightshorts and caressing her full, glorious ass before gripping her, digging his fingers into her flesh, pulling her closer to his body. His lion roared, ready to take her. Now. Hard. Fast. Link raised his eyes to meet hers and saw the same desire mirrored within. Her mouth was half open, breath coming in sharp gasps. "I want you," she whispered, pulling his hair, digging fingernails into his scalp, running them over his shoulders. "I need you." Her panther flashed in her eyes. The air about them sizzled with pent-up desire and electricity. That was all it took. Circe pulled off her t-shirt, and he feasted my eyes on her curvy body. He relished the idea of being able to feast on her again and again. Slowly, so slowly, he inched her panties down. One tiny bit at a time. She whimpered. Her hand flew to her mouth, biting her index finger between the first and second knuckle. Link grinned at the sexiness of her desire. She groaned impatiently, wriggling her legs to hasten the process. He took a deep breath, smelling the need of her. The passion of her yearning. Damn. He clenched his jaw to control the desire she brought out in him. If he didn't get some semblance of control, he'd lose his shit and release way too early. Link parted her legs and stared at the sight before him. She was so wet, glistening, ready for him to claim her. He lowered himself closer, stroking between her folds, watching her lift her hips in time with his strokes. She whimpered. Louder and louder. Finally, she cried out in relief when his index finger alit on her swollen clit. She closed her eyes, riding out the pleasure from his touch. "Watch me," Link insisted. She stared at him as he caressed her most sensitive spots. Her eyes flaring different colors, her breathing labored. The sound of a light bulb popping shattered the morning silence. Link damn near jumped out of his skin. A slight giggle erupted from her lips. Circe semi-grimaced at the side effects that her elemental caused when she was in the heat of passion. But Link loved it. He loved every second as much as he enjoyed all the other indicators of her desire. Like the one before him right now, her hips moved, gyrating, making her breasts heave as she breathed harder and harder, each moment coming closer to a climax. "Fuck, I need you," he growled, his lion evident in his voice. And as if he'd issued an invitation or a demand, her hand gripped his cock, moving up and down. Link watched her fingers while she stroked his length. The view and the sensation was almost too much, bringing him close to coming undone, but he gritted his teeth and kept himself reined in, while his own fingers pursued their objective with a fervor that only Circe could bring out in him. He moved his hands faster and faster, her own reaction spurring his actions. She was almost there. Yes. Yes. Her hips jerked upward once again as she grew rigid, exclamations turning into moans while she relaxed and yielded to the orgasm. "I need to be in you," he admitted with a groan. "Now." She spread her legs wider in an invitation he couldn't refuse. The scent of her sex enveloped him, filling his senses, dominating Link and his lion. He perched himself over Circe, his shaft pressed against her warm wetness, eager to gain entrance. And yet he held back, his eyes glued to hers, preparing himself to relish the moment soon to come. "Yes," she whispered, nodding. "Please. Now." Link drove forward, making her gasp. Her eyes flew open, gripping his shoulders with a power that had to have come from her panther. He covered her mouth with his, muffling her cries with his tongue, thrusting it in her mouth in time with his cock, driving into her. Faster. Harder. Over and over. Her hips jerked up in time with his. He relished the sound their bodies made, a sexy, sloppy slapping noise as they crashed into each other repeatedly. Link sunk into the moment, letting his body and his inner lion take over, slipping into and out of the boundaries between man and feline. He claimed her, wrote her, made her his. She would belong to no other. His and his alone. Nobody else would have her but him. She'd be his forever. This was how it was meant to be. He knew this was fated. She moaned with passion, and he groaned into her ear. "Give it to me," he urged her. "Yes." "Link?" She threw her head back, screaming his name as her body shuddered beneath his. She tightened around his hardness, clenching down on his length. At this point, with that pressure, with Circe climaxing around his cock, he couldn't keep himself from coming. Link stiffened, crying out against Circe's neck as he released. Circe was his mate. Forever. He bit into her neck, marking her as his. Forever. Her panther's snarl was a sign of approval as he let himself come undone while he made her his.
Epilogue. Circe was eating breakfast with Dina, learning all about the intricacies of a young one who was completely enthralled with the butterflies flitting about. Link strode up to them, his hair messy, his shirt untucked. God, she loved that look on him, his jeans covered in dust. "I may need to ask for a raise," he exclaimed as he leaned in to give her a kiss and at the same time pick up a squealing, joyful Dina. "I'll take that to the committee," Circe said with a smile. "I thought we took it to the committee this morning." "Link," Circe hissed a warning for him to behave while the heat of embarrassment rose to her cheeks. He laughed, a laugh that came from deep within, and twirled Dina in a circle, making her giggle. "I expected you to be sad, what with Mae and Jake pulling out this morning." He gave her a knowing look. Melancholy wove its way in and around Circe's heart. "I am. But I'm heartened with the knowledge I'll be seeing her again soon, when Astra has the baby." More than ever, Circe now understood why Mae had left when she found her mate so long ago. No forgiveness was needed. None at all. "I get to be her godmother," Dina interjected. "Astra and Cain told me so." "That's wonderful," Circe told her with a smile. She wriggled free of Link's arms and began to dance around. "I'll be Cameo's godmother. I'll be Cameo's godmother," she chanted over and over. Suddenly Dina came to a stop, crossed her arms over her chest and grew serious. "And I'll have a cousin soon too." Circe and Link both gave her a double take. "What's that?" Circe asked, indulging the energetic little girl with her fancies and ideas. "Renali told me." Albani told her. Link kneeled eye level to Dina. "Told her what, Didi?" "Circe's going to have a baby." Circe frowned. Wouldn't she know first? Wouldn't her panther know first? Wouldn't Link's lion have scented? She didn't want to contradict the little girl or to rain on her parade or dampen her excitement, but "It's true," Albani said in Circe's mind. "How can I not know?" Circe asked Albani. "You'd know in the next few days." Link was studying Circe with a concerned look in his eyes, and in their depths she saw doubt. Was that doubt about it being true? Or did he have doubts about their having a baby? Or her mind was tormenting her with options? "What?" Circe asked him. "Is it so?" Link queried. "It seems to be," Circe affirmed. The smile that curved his lips upward grew and grew. It reached his eyes and warmed her soul. Link took Circe in his arms, held her close, one hand on her belly, his eyes concerned. Dina swooped in, making it a group hug. "What dangers are there for you?" His smile had faded slightly, replaced with concern. "I'll be fine," Circe assured him. "We'll be fine. It's wonderful." Dina was bouncing again, in the confines of their hug. "What will we name her?" "Her?" Link gave Dina a mock frown. "Don't you think we have enough women running around here? Seems we men types are outnumbered," he said with a teasing smile. "And don't you forget it," Dina admonished, one hand on her hip, the other shaking a finger at him. Link gave Circe a sideways glance. "I blame you for this attitude." Circe smiled. "She'll be a force to be reckoned with one day. Won't you, Denaria Avila?" Dina raised one brow, looking far older than her years. A small fire erupted in the fire pit next to the patio table. Link shook his head. This was just the beginning, Circe thought. Just the beginning.
Thank you for listening. This has been a Shifters Forever Worlds book by L. Thorne. Stay tuned for more episodes. Don't forget to subscribe and to ring the bell to be notified of new releases.